Welcome to Audio Novel. If you enjoy my work, don't forget to like and subscribe. To access advanced chapters or support the author, visit their official page, link is in the description. Thank you for being part of this journey. Let's dive into the story. Chapter 201. Chapter 201. As the sound of prayers reached his ears, Syd keenly sensed a faint connection forming. Following this connection, he could even perceive the appearance of the person praying and their surroundings, as if he were physically present there, observing everything from a 360-degree omniscient view. Syd also had a distinct feeling that he could channel his divine power through this connection. If he were to perform a small miracle in front of the believer, their faith would undoubtedly increase significantly, and as a result, the power gathered from their belief would also grow, speeding up the enhancement of his divinity. This was all beneficial, and if possible, Syd wouldn't mind showing a sign when he was in a good mood or had the time. Unfortunately, one of the prayers he heard was from a believer asking to restore their sight. Syd's mouth twitched. He wasn't an all-powerful wish-granting machine, and with his current abilities, there was no way he could restore someone's sight. How could he help with that? Just as he thought this, he paused. Wait, maybe not. It depends on the situation. If it's a normal case of sight restoration, perhaps I can do it. For example, photon energy has the basic ability to accelerate the healing process. Although its healing effects aren't as extreme as Wolverine's, simple wound recovery is still possible. If the person's blindness is caused by an injury and not some congenital defect. Syd hesitated. In that case, if he tried, maybe. With curiosity and a willingness to experiment, he couldn't resist. He followed the mysterious connection to investigate the believer who prayed most devoutly, hoping to regain their sight. In the next moment, he perceived a scene. Inside a dim, but very tidy, dilapidated room. A middle-aged woman, around 40 years old, dressed in blue with blonde hair, knelt on the ground, clasping her hands together in prayer. Syd focused his attention on her closed eyes. What's wrong with her eyes? He was curious. As time passed, he gradually understood her situation. Using his powerful mental and psychic abilities, he observed this middle-aged woman as she left her dark room, using a cane for the blind to navigate through some streets. As she passed by, Syd overheard conversations from neighbors and passers-by. Audrey is so pitiful, just over 40, and blind. If you ask me, it's good she's blind. If she hadn't exposed herself at the hospital, I never would have known she was a mutant freak. Audrey didn't do anything wrong, right? Isn't that a bit harsh? What's wrong with it? Mutants are monsters, freaks. Audrey might seem fine now, but who knows when she'll lose control. When that happens, won't we be the ones to suffer? That can't be true. Listening to the neighbors' comments, Syd pieced together the situation. Apparently, this middle-aged woman named Audrey was once a nurse at a nearby hospital. During a critical situation with a patient, she accidentally revealed her mutant abilities. Her mutation allowed her eyes to adjust like a microscope, zooming in to see microscopic organisms and even gaining a rudimentary X-ray vision to see inside a patient's body. Overall, it was a useful ability for medicine. Unfortunately, even though she saved that patient by identifying the cause of their illness, enabling quick treatment, the hospital still discovered her mutation. Despite saving a life, the hospital fired her. The patient she saved didn't even thank her, and she became unemployed. Eventually, some extreme anti-mutant individuals heard about her situation. One night, while Audrey was sleeping, they cruelly blinded her by slashing her eyes with a knife. When the attacker was arrested, they proudly claimed they were doing the world a favor. To make matters worse, shortly after being incarcerated, the perpetrator was bailed out, likely due to the connection with Audrey's mutant status. Now, with her blindness, Audrey's already difficult life had become even more unbearable. If not for finding discarded food in the trash and her son occasionally helping her out of guilt, she might have already died in that broken-down little house. As for why she prayed to Syd, through the power of his mind scepter and his own mental and psychic abilities, Syd glimpsed into some of her memories and figured it out. Since the Battle of New York, news of Thor, a member of the Avengers, had spread worldwide. Audrey, already interested in Norse mythology, naturally believed that if Thor was real, then the other gods from Norse legends, like Baldur, must be real as well. So she prayed to Baldur, the god of light, hoping to regain her sight. Understanding the situation, Syd's mouth twitched. He wanted to tell her that just because he controlled light didn't mean he could restore her vision and bring her light. Well, that's not entirely true. If my divine speech were at level 5, I might be able to allow her to see, even if her eyes were damaged. After all, it's well known that living beings can see because of light. This power really is within my control. Syd pondered. Without light, nothing could be seen. Light is necessary for the photoreceptors in the retina to send visual information through the optic nerve to the brain, forming images. Without light, the photoreceptors are useless, and nothing can be seen, even if there's something right in front of you. And the colors of things are also determined by different wavelengths of light. If he changed the wavelength of the light slightly, the person could become colorblind. Come to think of it, could I strip away my enemy's vision? Or maybe even distort their perception, making them see chaotic images? Syd hesitated at the thought. The more he thought about it, the more his eyes lit up. It wasn't impossible to accomplish something like this. But for now, he wasn't confident in his control over light to achieve such feats. Forget it, I'll experiment with that later. For now, I need to focus on this believer. Syd turned his attention back to Audrey. As the sun gradually set, Audrey finished gathering food, a collection of items she found through touch and smell, and slowly made her way home. When she sat down before her food, clasping her hands together and praying in desperation once again, Syd's heart stirred, and he decided to try. End of chapter. Chapter 202, Chapter 202. New translation. Warhammer, starting as a planetary governor. Bright, mysterious, and radiating divinity like the sun, divine power flowed through the invisible connection and descended directly upon Audrey, or more specifically, around her eyes. Audrey, who had been praying, froze. She felt a vast presence approaching, accompanied by a warm sensation. She felt as though her eyes were wrapped in a soothing hot spring, giving her a comfortable feeling. At the same time, a slight itchiness emerged, and she almost couldn't resist scratching her eyes. Seeing this, Syd pondered. It seems that with the blessing of divine light, photon energy does have a self-healing effect, although it's quite slow. After about 10 minutes, Syd felt it was enough and stopped transmitting the photon energy. Audrey rubbed her eyes and then opened them. The moment she opened her eyes, she froze. Brilliant colors flooded her vision, a scene she had long missed. Audrey covered her mouth, tears of joy and excitement streaming down her face. She stood up and excitedly walked around the house, touching everything, and only after several minutes did she calm down. At the same time, she began to think about what had just happened. I was praying just now, could it be? And that feeling. Her eyes widened in disbelief as a shocking thought crossed her mind. Could it be that a god had descended? Did a god bless her and heal her eyes? Thinking of this, Audrey began to cry again, overwhelmed with emotion. I knew it. I knew it. There really are true gods in this world. Audrey's heart was filled with excitement and gratitude for the divine blessing, and she immediately knelt down to pray devoutly once more. Seeing Audrey's actions, Syd shook his head, not particularly concerned. However, just as he was thinking this, he suddenly noticed that the power of belief coming from Audrey had surged dramatically. If her belief had been a 1 before, it was now nearly 100. It was safe to say that the belief energy had skyrocketed, and even Syd could clearly feel the difference. Divinity experience +1. Syd's mouth twitched, surprise flashing in his eyes. That was just one person, and my divinity increased by 1 point. If there were more. At that moment, Syd couldn't help but feel a twinge of regret. Unfortunately, few people believed in him, and most of those who did were casual believers. In fact, Audrey was probably the most devout of them all. At the same time, Syd realized something. As expected, despair is the best catalyst for belief. Audrey had been in despair, and with just a small intervention, the power of her belief had skyrocketed. If her body had been whole and she hadn't been in despair, a simple blessing might not have made her this devout. As he pondered this, Audrey, having left her dark room, looked up at the setting sun, tears streaming down her face. Her unusual behavior attracted the attention of some neighbors and passers-by. Audrey, what's going on? A bearded middle-aged man hesitantly approached her, asking reflexively. In the light of the setting sun, others nearby also turned their attention to Audrey, curiosity and confusion evident on their faces. Audrey snapped out of her daze and, excitedly, blurted out, "I'm healed. My eyes are healed. I can see." Her words hung in the air. What? The people around her thought they had misheard and instinctively looked at Audrey's eyes. It was then they noticed that her eyes were open, bright and full of life, no longer clouded and scarred as they had been before. This is... The neighbors and passers-by were stunned. "Your eyes, healed. Oh my God, how is this possible? How could something like this happen? What's going on?" One by one, shocked questions came from their mouths. As time passed, more and more people gathered around. "What's going on here? What?" Everyone who learned about the situation was shocked, their eyes glued to Audrey's restored sight in disbelief. The middle-aged man who had first spoken, Lawrence, couldn't help himself. He stepped forward and grabbed Audrey's arm. "Audrey, what's going on? Your eyes were blind. I saw you earlier today. How did they suddenly heal?" This question was on everyone's mind, and all eyes were on Audrey, filled with confusion and suspicion. In her excitement, Audrey blurted out the answer. "I prayed to Baldur, the god of light. His grace, Lord Baldur, must have heard my prayer and descended a miracle to heal my eyes." Hearing Audrey's words, everyone around her froze for a moment before bombarding her with questions. "Baldur, the god of light. Who is that? Is that the name of a god?" Faced with their confused expressions, Audrey realized that few people now knew who Baldur, the god of light, was. Hurriedly, she explained, "He's a god from Asgard. You know the superhero Thor, right? Baldur, the god of light, is also a son of Odin and Thor's younger brother." As she finished speaking, the neighbors and passers-by had a look of realization on their faces. If Audrey hadn't explained it, they wouldn't have known who Baldur, the god of light, was. Now that she had, they understood who she was talking about. "So, this god of light, Baldur, who has never appeared before, heard your prayer and performed a miracle to heal your eyes. Really?" Though they now knew which god Audrey was referring to, the neighbors and passers-by were still skeptical. After all, Baldur, the god of light, was a god. Why would he suddenly intervene to help Audrey? Most of them doubted this point, and some even questioned whether Baldur, the god of light, had the power to perform such miracles at all. "You have to believe me, I'm telling the truth." Seeing their disbelief, Audrey, the middle-aged woman, grew anxious, trying to explain herself. At that moment, a tall, muscular man with a cruel look on his face approached. "Your eyes are healed." As soon as he arrived, Gisli was shocked. After recovering from his shock, he maliciously stared at Audrey's eyes, clearly intending something bad. Seeing this man, Audrey's face turned pale immediately, because he was the one who had blinded her. End of chapter. Chapter 203, Chapter 203. 100 reviews reached. Next goal, 120. How did you do it? Gisli stared incredulously at Audrey's eyes, unable to comprehend how he had blinded her, yet her sight had suddenly returned. Audrey, she. At that moment, a bystander explained what had happened, mentioning that Audrey had been blessed by Baldur, the god of light from the Asgardian legends, who had healed her eyesight. Upon hearing this, Gisli's malicious gaze fixated on Audrey. He didn't believe for a second that some so-called god had blessed Audrey. To him, it was just an excuse. In his mind, the restoration of Audrey's eyesight must have been related to her mutant ability, surely she had used it to heal herself. Sneering, Gisli said, "A god. That's just your excuse. You disgusting mutant, you must have used your powers to heal yourself." Without waiting for Audrey or anyone else to respond, Gisli reached behind him and pulled out a small dagger he carried for protection. In Audrey's shocked cry, Gisli moved to stab her in the eyes once again. Audrey's face fell into despair. Her mutant ability had no combat potential, and as a woman, she was no match for this man. Resisting would be futile. As for the nearby neighbors, including Lawrence, they hesitated when they saw Gisli pull out the knife. Audrey's mutant status made them wary and fearful, so no one stepped forward to help her. In fact, a few women even looked on with schadenfreude. Audrey's eyes are about to be blinded again, haha. Let's hope a god will fix them again next time. They didn't believe in the so-called god either, thinking it was merely an excuse Audrey had come up with. What they didn't know was that the god they spoke of was watching them all from the shadows. Seeing this, Syd raised an eyebrow. He had just restored this woman's sight, and before he could even shift his attention, this mutant-hating man wanted to ruin everything. If his attention had been elsewhere, he might not have cared, but now. There was no need for further thought. Syd immediately summoned the power of the God of Light. The next moment, an astonishing scene unfolded before everyone's eyes. The light around them intensified, becoming blindingly bright. Syd hadn't done much, simply focusing sunlight on the men before him. It was as if countless magnifying glasses were concentrating the sun's rays on one spot. Ah! What is this? A scream erupted as Gisli dropped the dagger, writhing in agony from the intense heat that burned him as he rolled on the ground. What's happening? In his agonized thrashing, Gisli's mind could only focus on one question. What was this light? Could it be? In his last moments of life, a terrifying thought crossed Gisli's mind. Was this the punishment of Baldur, the god of light, from the legends? How could that be? Gisli was in disbelief. Could gods really exist? No, Baldur, the god of light. Do gods truly exist? At the brink of death, Gisli still couldn't believe it. At the same time, his heart filled with jealousy, resentment, and hatred. Why would the god help Audrey, this disgusting mutant, and not him, a normal human? Damn it. I'm not willing to accept this. With that thought, Gisli finally passed out, his body motionless, like a piece of roasted fish. His death was swift and complete. Syd cast a glance at the men and dismissed him without another thought. However, while Syd no longer cared, the people around them certainly did. Seeing Gisli, now dead from extreme sun exposure, including Audrey herself, everyone gasped in shock. Some who saw his corpse even retched on the spot. Despite their physical discomfort, their minds raced. What had just happened? Gisli had barely spoken a few words and was about to act, and now he lay dead, roasted by the sun. The crowd didn't need to think too hard. The name of a certain god immediately came to their minds. Baldur, the god of light, was this his doing? Does this god truly exist? And does he possess such terrifying power? Lawrence and the other neighbors and passers-by looked on with disbelief. Audrey hadn't lied. Was what she said true? One by one, incredulous gazes turned toward Audrey. Is everything you said true? Lawrence asked in disbelief. Was all of this really a miracle? Feeling their eyes on her, Audrey nodded and said, "It's true. My eyes were indeed healed by Lord Baldur, the god of light, and this man's death must be his punishment. After all, my eyes had just been healed, and this man tried to blind me again. Such an act of destroying the blessing of a god, his death is something no one else is to blame for." Audrey was well aware that the punishment was not because of her but because this man had offended the god. Hearing this, Lawrence and the others finally understood. At the same time, those who had doubted the power of this god couldn't help but feel a chill of fear. Luckily, they hadn't said or done anything offensive. At this moment, a middle-aged woman named Karen hesitantly asked, "But Audrey, why would Baldur, the god of light, suddenly bless you?" As she spoke, the others also turned puzzled looks toward Audrey. That was a good point. They were all the same. Audrey was only slightly different because she was a mutant. But as far as gods were concerned, besides the Messiah and the White Knight, no mutant would likely catch their attention or earn their favor, right? Besides, Audrey's mutant ability was practically useless. Modern technology could easily achieve what she could do. If Audrey wasn't lying, why would Baldur, the god of light, favor her? Although none of them said it aloud, a sense of jealousy welled up in everyone's hearts. Audrey hesitated for a moment before answering, "Maybe it's because I've always been devoted to Lord Baldur and have been praying to him constantly." Hearing this, Lawrence and the others widened their eyes in astonishment. That's it. For a moment, their hearts were filled with complicated emotions, and they didn't know what to say. At the same time, a few new thoughts began to form in their minds. End of chapter. Chapter 204, Chapter 204. New translation. Warhammer, starting as a planetary governor. What if they also? Could it be possible that Lord Baldur, the god of light, might also bless them or grant them power? Lifespan, strength, authority. Lawrence and the others' eyes flickered as countless possibilities played out in their minds. Rapid breathing filled the air, and soon, nearly everyone was caught up in their own thoughts. After all, there was no harm in believing. If nothing happened, fine, but if it did. Thanks to the Mind Stone and his own psychic abilities, Syd sensed their scattered thoughts and desires. At that moment, he couldn't help but twitch his mouth in disbelief at how far their imaginations had gone. Just then, Lawrence was the first to snap out of his reverie. After glancing at Audrey, his eyes fell on Gisli's lifeless body lying on the ground. Only now did he feel a twinge of fear as he hesitantly said, "He's dead, right? What should we do with the body?" The gathered neighbors and passers-by also came back to reality, and a few brave souls approached Gisli. They instinctively checked for signs of life and quickly recoiled after confirming he wasn't breathing. Though Gisli was dead, they still called 911, requesting both an ambulance and the police. It didn't take long for the paramedics and police to arrive. Faced with questions from the officers, everyone answered truthfully, and the police quickly pieced together the basic situation. However, once they understood what had happened, the officers exchanged confused glances. A god from Asgard delivered divine punishment and killed someone. Are you serious? What they heard was hard to believe. If it were true, then this matter was out of their jurisdiction, they couldn't do anything about it. After all, if a god from Asgard killed someone, there was nothing they could do. Even if the god killed 10 people, they wouldn't dare take action against him. Besides, could they even capture a god? The question wasn't whether they should, but whether they even had the power to do so. They might end up getting wiped out in the process. The police and medical staff had no doubts about this and didn't think it was beyond a god's capability. That said, due to Audrey's involvement and the uncertainty of the situation, she was taken in as the prime suspect, though the officers were careful not to show any hostility towards her. Fear of offending the god of light kept even those who harbored anti-mutant sentiments from acting out. They didn't want to risk being killed by Baldur in a fit of anger. While Audrey was taken away, the large crowd of onlookers, including Lawrence and dozens of others, remained at the scene. They were still discussing the matter of the god when a middle-aged man named Richard, who had witnessed the miracle earlier, suddenly remembered something. Speaking of Lord Baldur, the god of light, while he's never shown himself before, I recall something related to him. Hearing this, those around him turned their confused gazes toward him. What is it? The Prince of Asgard, the son of Odin, has never appeared before. What could there possibly be about him? Richard pursed his lips and said, "Don't you remember that strange event a while back? The whole earth was bathed in light." At his words, the crowd was shocked, looking at him in disbelief. Are you kidding? That has something to do with Baldur. Wasn't that event related to God? The crowd remained skeptical. Richard, however, shook his head and said, "It's true that the event where Earth was bathed in light could be the work of God, but it's also possible that it was Lord Baldur's doing. Doesn't it seem like too much of a coincidence to you?" Not long after that worldwide light event, Lord Baldur appears on Earth and performs a miracle. If you're telling me there's no connection, I won't believe it. As they listened to Richard's explanation, Lawrence and the others were stunned. Only now did they realize how it could be true. It was indeed a little too coincidental. Could it be? Could it really be? At that moment, their hearts were filled with disbelief and astonishment. No, this can't be real. My God. If it was true, then wasn't Lord Baldur's power a bit too terrifying, too unbelievable? As the crowd was reeling from the revelation, a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent wearing a baseball cap, who had been sent to gather intelligence on this supernatural event, blinked in shock. Quietly stepping away from the crowd, he moved to an empty corner and immediately reported Richard's speculation to S.H.I.E.L.D. After completing his report, Agent Vernon, a level 5 S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, wore a grim expression. If this is true, then the ramifications are huge. S.H.I.E.L.D. will have to take this new god of light seriously. As he pondered, the onlookers, each of them, came to their own decisions. No matter what, when they returned home, they would try to pray to Lord Baldur. It was clear that Lord Baldur could bless and heal people, and he possessed immense power. And who knew what other abilities he had? If they prayed devoutly, perhaps they too could be blessed with miracles, just like Audrey. Their eyes burned with fervor, and many quietly began praying to themselves. At that moment, as their mindset shifted, small amounts of belief energy began to emanate from them. Although it wasn't much, as time passed, the belief energy showed signs of growing stronger. As they continued to pray and even prepared to share the events with their families, Agent Hill received the intelligence report and immediately made her way to the director's office to inform Director Fury. Knock, knock, knock. Agent Hill knocked on the door, and after receiving permission, she entered the office. What is it? Nick Fury set down the files he had been working on and looked at her with curiosity. With urgency, Agent Hill wasted no time in explaining everything to Nick Fury. What did you say? Nick Fury was stunned. Another god had appeared. An Asgardian god. Odin's son, Baldur, the god of light. More importantly, the light that had enveloped the earth not long ago might have been related to this Baldur. Nick Fury's heart trembled. If this were true, how terrifying would Baldur be? Did Thor know about this? End of chapter. Chapter 205, Chapter 205. Fury's heart raced. He could hardly imagine it. If this were true, how terrifying must Baldur be? The light that had enveloped the entire earth. After his initial shock, he quickly calmed down, thinking that this might not be true. After all, it was just one person's account, and the truth of the matter needed to be verified. In fact, given how unbelievable this situation sounded, Fury considered it more likely to be false. As he pondered, Fury fixed his single eye on Agent Hill and asked in a stern tone, "Have you done a lie detector test?" "Arrangements are already being made, sir." Agent Hill responded immediately, adding that psychological experts and polygraphs were being prepared, but it would take some time. However, due to their apprehension about Lord Baldur, the god of light, they had refrained from using any harsher methods, such as truth serum, which could harm the body. Nick Fury nodded and waited quietly for the results. After several minutes, Agent Hill's earpiece buzzed with the test results. After listening to the report, Hill turned to Fury and said, "Sir, after several rounds of testing, our experts found no signs of deception. Unless something extraordinary is at play, what she said appears to be true." Nick Fury's heart jolted once again. It was true. Unable to hold back, Fury asked, "Can you check where Thor is right now?" Still skeptical, Fury wanted to ask Thor directly about Baldur, the god of light, and find out what was going on. "Right away, sir," Agent Hill responded with a nod. It didn't take long for her to gather the information and relay Thor's location to Nick Fury. Without wasting any time, Fury headed to the destination where Thor was located. Before long, Fury arrived at a bar and entered to find Thor sitting at a table, drinking. As Thor took a sip, he noticed Nick Fury, dressed in his signature black leather jacket, walking over. Curious, Thor asked, "I hear you've been looking for me. What brings you here?" "Hey, this drink is great, want a glass?" Thor raised his cup with a grin. "No thanks," Fury declined, raising a hand before getting straight to the point. "I'm here to ask you about something." "About what?" Thor's face showed surprise and confusion as he continued drinking, wondering why the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. would seek him out. He figured it might be something related to Loki again, and the thought troubled him. Just as he was mulling this over, Fury's expression turned serious. In a stern voice, he asked, "I'm here to ask you about Baldur, the god of light. How much do you know about him?" After speaking, Fury fixed his gaze on Thor, waiting for him to reveal what he knew about Baldur. To his surprise, Thor's response was completely unexpected. "Baldur, the god of light? Who's that?" In the noisy bar, Thor put down his drink and looked at Fury with genuine confusion. Fury frowned, slightly annoyed. "Thor, I'm not in the mood for jokes. This is important. If you know anything about Baldur, you'd better tell me." Now realizing the seriousness of the situation, Thor furrowed his brow and replied, "You're going to have to explain who this god of light is, because I honestly have no idea who you're talking about." Fury took a deep breath, his tone shifting into one of slight accusation. "In our mythology, you are Odin's eldest son. Baldur, the god of light, is the second son of Odin and Frigga, which makes him your brother." Hearing this, Thor shook his head with a laugh. "That's just human mythology. As far as I know, there's no such god of light named Baldur. Fury, you have to understand, myths don't always match reality." As he spoke, Thor spread his arms in an exaggerated gesture. "You're telling me there's no such god in Asgard?" Fury stared intently at Thor's face for any signs of deception, but he found none. His heart filled with suspicion. Fury pressed, but how could a god that you claim doesn't exist perform a miracle recently? What do you mean? Thor was taken aback, confusion evident on his face. Fury then recounted how Audrey's eyesight had been miraculously restored and how Gisli had been punished by a divine light right after attacking her. Thor listened, his surprise growing, and by the end, his mouth hung slightly open, bewilderment clear on his face. Finally, Fury, with a grave and serious expression, mentioned the global phenomenon that had bathed the earth in light, suggesting that it might be related to Baldur, the god of light. Thor froze. Fury might not know this, but Thor was very familiar with the global light event. He had personally witnessed Asgard being enveloped in light, and after questioning Heimdall, the gatekeeper, he learned that it wasn't just Asgard, the entire 9 realms had been bathed in that light. Now, hearing that Fury suspected this Baldur was behind the phenomenon, Thor couldn't help but be shocked. Fury, let me tell you something. Thor proceeded to explain that the light phenomenon hadn't just affected Earth, it had also enveloped Asgard and the other realms. He shared everything he knew about the strange event with Fury. When he finished, Fury stared at Thor in disbelief, struggling to comprehend what he had just heard. Not only Earth, but the phenomenon had appeared across all the realms, including Asgard. If this event really was caused by Baldur, Fury realized he might have grossly underestimated him. This could no longer be described as mere power, this was something far more terrifying. Fury couldn't believe it and found it hard to imagine what kind of strength would be required to cause such a vast and terrifying phenomenon. Where did this god of light, Baldur, even come from? Why was it that, out of nowhere, another one of these powerful beings appeared? After being stunned for several moments, Fury regained his composure and said to Thor, "That's why I came to find you. If this phenomenon really is connected to Baldur, then this situation is extremely serious." Thor, too, realized the gravity of the matter. End of chapter. Chapter 206, Chapter 206. 500 PS reached. Next goal, 1000 PS. Even Thor could imagine the terrifying power someone with such overwhelming strength would wield. So, based on mythology, you believe this god of light is connected to Asgard, and that Baldur might be my brother? Fury nodded. Seeing his affirmation, Thor fell into deep thought, racking his brain to recall any memories. However, no matter how much he tried, he couldn't remember ever having a brother named Baldur, nor did he know who this god of light was. But at the same time, Thor wasn't entirely certain that he didn't have a brother like that. He muttered, "I don't know everything about father's affairs. I didn't even know about Loki until recently." At that point, Thor paused, choosing not to continue. Nick Fury, however, understood the implication, and gravely said, "So you're saying we can't rule out the possibility that Baldur might be your brother? You're unsure if your father and mother had another son?" Thor nodded in agreement, just as he was about to speak again. Suddenly, he froze, recalling something Nick Fury had said. Brother. Thor's mind raced, and an image flashed through his thoughts. A figure dressed in white, who had recently donned mysterious black clothing, his brother. The White Knight. Baldur, the god of light. Is it him? Thor murmured in shock. Nick Fury immediately asked, "What do you mean, him?" Snapping back to the moment, Thor responded, "I don't know when I gained another brother, but if you're talking about someone who has recently surfaced and might be my brother, then there's only one possibility. Fury, you know who I'm talking about, the White Knight." At this, Nick Fury felt as though the bustling noise of the bar had suddenly gone silent. His heart filled with disbelief. Could the White Knight really be Baldur, the god of light? How could that be? Nick Fury wanted to shake his head in denial. He couldn't fathom the idea. The White Knight already possessed abilities akin to miracles. If he also had the power to summon light capable of enveloping the entire Earth and Asgard, just how terrifying and unstoppable would he become? But despite his reluctance, Fury's mind began to gradually accept the possibility, as the pieces started to fit. After all, the White Knight had long been suspected of being Thor's brother, potentially holding the identity of a god from Asgard. He simply hadn't revealed his true nature. If the White Knight turned out to be the god of light, Baldur, it would make perfect sense. Moreover, it seemed unlikely that a completely unknown son of Odin would suddenly emerge. The White Knight's power had always been mysterious and formidable. If he truly possessed the ability to blanket the entire Earth and Asgard in light, it would be logical. This realization also hinted at something else. If all of this were true, the White Knight, no, Baldur, the god of light, might have been hiding his true strength all along. His real power was beyond imagination. Just thinking about the light that had enveloped the entire earth, and even Asgard, sent a chill down Fury's spine. After a moment of discussion, Thor and Fury exchanged glances, both of their faces showing the lingering shock. Finally, Fury said, "If you get the chance, I'd appreciate it if you could ask your father and mother about Baldur, the god of light." "All right, I've got some matters to attend to, so I'll be going." With that, Fury hurried out of the bar and into a black car, driving off to handle the situation regarding Baldur, the god of light. Watching him leave, Thor lost his desire to continue drinking. Grumbling to himself, he muttered, "I want to go back to Asgard and tell father and mother about this, but it's all Loki's fault for destroying the Bifrost." Frustration filled him, along with a mix of emotions. Nervousness, excitement, anticipation, and more surged through him. If the speculation was true, and Baldur, the god of light, really was the White Knight, his brother, how exciting would that be? Having a brother so powerful, who wouldn't be thrilled? Thor thought excitedly, with this kind of strength, not even father could stand against him. Seriously, though, when did father and mother keep this secret and give me a brother? Thor mused, though the idea of Baldur being Odin's illegitimate child briefly crossed his mind. However, he quickly dismissed the thought. Either way, he considered the White Knight his brother. He was already thinking about how he could share this news with Hogun, Fandral, and Sif so he could boast a little in front of them. As Thor mulled over how to get back to Asgard, Nick Fury, on his way to S.H.I.E.L.D., instructed Agent Hill to quickly gather all available information on Baldur, the god of light. He also considered informing the rest of the Avengers. Soon, Captain America, Black Widow, and even Tony Stark, resting in his luxurious villa, received messages from Nick Fury. As they read through the information, each one of them wore a look of disbelief. The mysterious, powerful White Knight was actually an Asgardian god of light. What shocked them even more was Fury's message stating that the recent light phenomenon might also be connected to him. The light that had enveloped the entire Earth. Fury even informed them that the phenomenon had not only occurred on Earth but also in Asgard and other realms. In the opulent villa. "Jarvis, do you think gods really exist in this world?" Tony Stark asked in disbelief. "Sir, I'm unsure. However, based on the available information, the probability of gods existing is quite high. After all, Thor is proof of that. But I believe you are referring to something beyond just Thor's kind of existence." While they discussed, Captain America, Black Widow, Hawkeye, and Bruce Banner were also left reeling with shock, their minds filled with confusion and disbelief. Chapter 207, Chapter 207. A notification sounded in Syd's mind. Divinity Experience +1. Ability, Divinity, 484/500, Level 2. Hearing the prompt, Syd was a bit surprised. It hasn't been that long, and yet the power of belief has increased this much. His thoughts immediately returned to the group of people surrounding Audrey earlier. It was obvious now that this newfound surge of belief came from them. In fact, the flow of belief seemed to be growing, suggesting that those people might have spread the word to others. Although the overall number of believers was still small, compared to the sporadic trickle he'd been getting before, this was a significant improvement. The belief these people are generating should be enough to push my divinity to level 3 in no time. Syd felt good about this. While waiting for his divinity to upgrade, he shifted his focus to strengthening his other abilities, divine speech, the power of light, and his Asgardian physique. He began to speak, enhancing the strength of his divine speech, while simultaneously channeling his photon energy to increase his light power and the resilience of his Asgardian body. It was an unprecedented moment for him. He was upgrading 4 abilities at once. 1. Each ability continued to rise steadily. Divine Speech Experience +1. Light Power Experience +1. Asgardian Physique Experience +1. As time passed, the sun set and the moon rose, followed by the dawn of a new day. The morning sunlight streamed down. Feeling the warmth of the sun, Syd shifted his attention back to his divinity. After a full night of absorbing belief, his level 2 divinity had reached. Ability, Divinity, 499/500, Level 2. A few minutes later, Syd heard the long-awaited notification. Divinity Experience +1. Ability, Divinity, 0 out of 1000, level 3. In the next instant, Syd felt a surge of mysterious power coursing through his body, mind, and soul. With this increase in strength, every aspect of his power grew stronger, and his ability to control his internal energy became significantly easier. Soon, the sound of a sonic boom echoed as Syd began testing his new abilities. Through his experiments, he discovered that his flight speed had increased to 5.4 times the speed of sound, a notable jump from the 4.5 he had previously achieved. My speed now far exceeds that of most conventional missiles. Syd was confident that if the missiles that had attacked him a while back came again, he could easily outmaneuver and surpass them. With his current speed of Mach 5.4, he could leave those missiles far behind. Of course, Syd was well aware that there were faster missiles out there, ones far quicker than what he could currently avoid. His flight speed was only barely sufficient for now, and he would need to continue improving it. Moreover, flight speed and ground speed were two different things. Syd couldn't always rely on being in the sky, so his physical speed on the ground would need to increase as well. Once his Asgardian physique reached level 5, his overall speed would likely get a significant boost. He wondered if he could break the sound barrier and achieve sonic speed while on the ground. Syd looked forward to the possibility. Thinking about missiles made him recall the military that had launched them at him. When he eventually discovered the location of their base, he'd be sure to pay them a visit. And if he happened to encounter any military personnel in the meantime, Syd wouldn't mind sending them to meet their maker. He suspected the military was already plotting something, likely devising new ways to deal with him. Shaking off these thoughts, Syd refocused on increasing his power. Before long, the familiar notifications of his abilities increasing sounded once again. Aside from these ongoing upgrades, Syd had another plan in mind, seeking out Jane, Thor's former love interest from the original storyline. Why former? Because, thanks to his interference, Syd noticed that Thor and Jane didn't seem as close anymore. Their relationship was now more flirtatious than anything serious. Syd found the situation amusing. Of course, while he found it interesting, he didn't feel any awkwardness or guilt about it. In the original timeline, Thor and Jane were together, but Thor was clearly not the type for romance. He was always too busy with battles and Asgardian affairs, leaving little time for Jane. Thor wasn't the kind of person who would get anxious after not seeing Jane for a day. He wasn't in love to that degree. At first, Jane could understand this, but as time went on, she became frustrated. She complained that after getting together with Thor, they hardly ever saw each other, making her feel like she was with a stranger. Her words were filled with sadness, and while Thor knew she was upset, he offered no comfort, just an awkward excuse that he was busy, which only made her feel worse. On top of all that, the difference in their lifespans was another reason their relationship wasn't meant to last. Odin had even strongly opposed their union, knowing that Jane's few decades were nothing compared to Thor's long life, and Thor wasn't around often enough to make their relationship worthwhile. During this period, Thor had once unintentionally asked Mjolnir, his hammer, to protect Jane. Mjolnir responded by glowing, seemingly agreeing to Thor's request, though he hadn't noticed it at the time. This was why Jane could lift Mjolnir and later become the female Thor. Unfortunately, Thor's bad luck struck again. Jane, who had taken up the mantle of Thor, eventually died of cancer, fading away in Thor's arms, yet another person to die before him. However, because of my interference, Thor never got the chance to ask Mjolnir for that favor. So now, it's unclear if Jane can even lift Mjolnir. Syd didn't care much about the messy love story between Thor and Jane, though. His interest in Jane lay elsewhere. The town battle with the destroyer, which Loki had sent, was quite some time ago. If things go as expected, Jane will soon stumble upon the reality stone. Syd stroked his chin, deciding he would try to steer Jane in the right direction, maybe even speed up her discovery of the reality stone, otherwise known as the Ether. Thinking about the Ether, Syd couldn't help but recall its connection to Asgard. The Ether originally belonged to the Dark Elves, and thousands of years ago, the cruel Dark Elf Malekith attempted to use the Ether to return the universe to its dark origins. Syd smirked at the thought. That Dark Elf really had lofty ambitions. I think he might have been delusional. Without the support of other Infinity Stones, the Dark Elves wouldn't have been able to harness the Ether's full power. The power of an Infinity Stone is always limited by its wielder. If the Reality Stone were that easy to use, Thanos would have gone straight for it. Why bother collecting all the other Infinity Stones and creating the gauntlet? Syd shook his head. In the end, Malekith never had the chance to fully wield the Aether's power. The righteous Asgardian forces dispatched via the Bifrost dealt with him swiftly. And eventually, the Aether ended up in the hands of the Asgardian army. End of chapter. Chapter 207. Chapter 207. A notification sounded in Syd's mind. Divinity experience +1. Ability, Divinity, 484/500, Level 2. Hearing the prompt, Syd was a bit surprised. It hasn't been that long, and yet the power of belief has increased this much. His thoughts immediately returned to the group of people surrounding Audrey earlier. It was obvious now that this newfound surge of belief came from them. In fact, the flow of belief seemed to be growing, suggesting that those people might have spread the word to others. Although the overall number of believers was still small, compared to the sporadic trickle he'd been getting before, this was a significant improvement. The belief these people are generating should be enough to push my divinity to level 3 in no time. Syd felt good about this. While waiting for his divinity to upgrade, he shifted his focus to strengthening his other abilities, divine speech, the power of light, and his Asgardian physique. He began to speak, enhancing the strength of his divine speech, while simultaneously channeling his photon energy to increase his light power and the resilience of his Asgardian body. It was an unprecedented moment for him. He was upgrading 4 abilities at once. 1. Each ability continued to rise steadily. Divine speech experience +1. Light power experience +1. Asgardian physique experience +1. As time passed, the sun set and the moon rose, followed by the dawn of a new day. The morning sunlight streamed down. Feeling the warmth of the sun, Syd shifted his attention back to his divinity. After a full night of absorbing belief, his level 2 divinity had reached. Ability, Divinity, 499/500, Level 2. A few minutes later, Syd heard the long-awaited notification. Divinity experience +1. Ability, Divinity, 0 out of 1000, Level 3. In the next instant, Syd felt a surge of mysterious power coursing through his body, mind, and soul. With this increase in strength, every aspect of his power grew stronger, and his ability to control his internal energy became significantly easier. Soon, the sound of a sonic boom echoed as Syd began testing his new abilities. Through his experiments, he discovered that his flight speed had increased to 5.4 times the speed of sound, a notable jump from the 4.5 he had previously achieved. My speed now far exceeds that of most conventional missiles. Syd was confident that if the missiles that had attacked him a while back came again, he could easily outmaneuver and surpass them. With his current speed of Mach 5.4, he could leave those missiles far behind. Of course, Syd was well aware that there were faster missiles out there, ones far quicker than what he could currently avoid. His flight speed was only barely sufficient for now, and he would need to continue improving it. Moreover, flight speed and ground speed were two different things. Syd couldn't always rely on being in the sky, so his physical speed on the ground would need to increase as well. Once his Asgardian physique reached level 5, his overall speed would likely get a significant boost. He wondered if he could break the sound barrier and achieve sonic speed while on the ground. Syd looked forward to the possibility. Thinking about missiles made him recall the military that had launched them at him. When he eventually discovered the location of their base, he'd be sure to pay them a visit. And if he happened to encounter any military personnel in the meantime, Syd wouldn't mind sending them to meet their maker. He suspected the military was already plotting something, likely devising new ways to deal with him. Shaking off these thoughts, Syd refocused on increasing his power. Before long, the familiar notifications of his abilities increasing sounded once again. Aside from these ongoing upgrades, Syd had another plan in mind, seeking out Jane, Thor's former love interest from the original storyline. Why former? Because, thanks to his interference, Syd noticed that Thor and Jane didn't seem as close anymore. Their relationship was now more flirtatious than anything serious. Syd found the situation amusing. Of course, while he found it interesting, he didn't feel any awkwardness or guilt about it. In the original timeline, Thor and Jane were together, but Thor was clearly not the type for romance. He was always too busy with battles and Asgardian affairs, leaving little time for Jane. Thor wasn't the kind of person who would get anxious after not seeing Jane for a day. He wasn't in love to that degree. At first, Jane could understand this, but as time went on, she became frustrated. She complained that after getting together with Thor, they hardly ever saw each other, making her feel like she was with a stranger. Her words were filled with sadness, and while Thor knew she was upset, he offered no comfort, just an awkward excuse that he was busy, which only made her feel worse. On top of all that, the difference in their lifespans was another reason their relationship wasn't meant to last. Odin had even strongly opposed their union, knowing that Jane's few decades were nothing compared to Thor's long life, and Thor wasn't around often enough to make their relationship worthwhile. During this period, Thor had once unintentionally asked Mjolnir, his hammer, to protect Jane. Mjolnir responded by glowing, seemingly agreeing to Thor's request, though he hadn't noticed it at the time. This was why Jane could lift Mjolnir and later become the female Thor. Unfortunately, Thor's bad luck struck again. Jane, who had taken up the mantle of Thor, eventually died of cancer, fading away in Thor's arms, yet another person to die before him. However, because of my interference, Thor never got the chance to ask Mjolnir for that favor. So now, it's unclear if Jane can even lift Mjolnir. Syd didn't care much about the messy love story between Thor and Jane, though. His interest in Jane lay elsewhere. The town battle with the destroyer, which Loki had sent, was quite some time ago. If things go as expected, Jane will soon stumble upon the reality stone. Syd stroked his chin, deciding he would try to steer Jane in the right direction, maybe even speed up her discovery of the reality stone, otherwise known as the Ether. Thinking about the Ether, Syd couldn't help but recall its connection to Asgard. The Ether originally belonged to the Dark Elves, and thousands of years ago, the cruel Dark Elf Malekith attempted to use the Ether to return the universe to its dark origins. Syd smirked at the thought. That Dark Elf really had lofty ambitions. I think he might have been delusional. Without the support of other Infinity Stones, the Dark Elves wouldn't have been able to harness the Ether's full power. The power of an Infinity Stone is always limited by its wielder. If the Reality Stone were that easy to use, Thanos would have gone straight for it. Why bother collecting all the other Infinity Stones and creating the gauntlet? Syd shook his head. In the end, Malekith never had the chance to fully wield the Ether's power. The righteous Asgardian forces dispatched via the Bifrost dealt with him swiftly. And eventually, the Ether ended up in the hands of the Asgardian army. End of chapter. Chapter 208, Chapter 208. The power of the Ether was immense, and no ordinary means could destroy it. Ultimately, it was buried deep underground, essentially sealed away due to its overwhelming strength. However, where exactly it was buried, Syd was unsure. He only knew that the Ether resided in a hidden space, accessible through a spatial rift located somewhere on Earth during the convergence of the 9 realms. As he pondered this, Syd began his search for Jane. Thanks to his previous observations, it didn't take long for him to find her, busy at work. Instead of approaching directly, Syd used Jane's friend, Darcy, to guide her toward the next step. In the workspace. What's this? Jane asked, puzzled as she stared at the device Darcy handed her. It was a palm-sized monitor, emitting a steady beeping noise while displaying some strange data. Is it broken? Jane asked as she tapped it against the desk, trying to get it working properly. I already tried that, but it didn't work. I thought you'd try something a bit more scientific. Darcy shrugged. A few hours later, Jane, Darcy, and an intern were out in the field, equipped with their instruments. They found themselves at an expansive, long-abandoned shipping company's facility. The area was overgrown with weeds and damp, seemingly untouched for years. Is this the place? Watching from several meters above, Syd hovered, completely invisible. His curiosity was piqued as he followed the trio. Without hesitation, he moved silently, flying after them into the facility. Thanks to his optical cloaking, neither Jane nor Darcy could sense his presence. Syd observed quietly as they wandered through the abandoned site, searching for something. Soon, they stumbled upon something strange. Gravity seemed to be acting abnormally. An old, discarded car sat in the dimly lit warehouse, and when Darcy accidentally touched it, the car began to float. God! The astonishing sight left them speechless. Syd glanced at them briefly before turning his attention elsewhere. After a moment of thought, he left the trio and headed toward a staircase. He didn't fly up this time but instead walked up slowly. Upon reaching the 3rd floor, Syd casually picked up a stone and tossed it downward. The gray stone fell with a whoosh, but instead of hearing the sound of it hitting the floor, the stone vanished, only to reappear above him moments later, falling again. The stone was caught in a loop, falling, disappearing, then reappearing overhead in a continuous cycle. The space here is definitely unstable. Syd keenly sensed the strange spatial fluctuations. However, the spatial disturbance seemed weaker than he had anticipated, likely because he had arrived too early. Objects he threw now only reappeared above, rather than being transported to another place through the rift. A slight concern crossed his mind: had he come too soon to access the space where the ether resided? After a moment, he shook his head. If I can't access it now, I'll use spatial manipulation or the Tesseract later. One way or another, I'll reach that place. As this thought crossed his mind, he heard footsteps approaching. It was Jane and the others. A while later, Jane noticed the readings on her instruments fluctuating wildly, the device beeping incessantly. She had seen something like this before. The same phenomenon had occurred when Thor arrived through the Bifrost. Instinctively, she followed the data, searching for the source of the disturbance. Syd, observing Jane closely, mused, I remember the entrance to the ether's dimension being somewhere else. Following Jane should lead to the right place. However, as he trailed behind her, a question arose in his mind. Syd recalled that Jane had been pulled into the dimensional rift by a mysterious gust of wind. But this place wasn't particularly windy. How could there be a gust strong enough to move a full-grown woman? There had to be some other force at play, something hidden, exerting power behind the scenes. Was it a dark elf, or the ether itself? Syd frowned, leaning more toward the idea that it was the ether's doing. He had long suspected that the Infinity Stones had some level of sentience, choosing their wielders and, in some cases, even resisting them. Of course, even if the stones had some form of intelligence, they couldn't fully activate their power without a user to channel it. As Syd pondered this, he suddenly noticed that Jane had reached the location. The device in her hand beeped louder and faster than ever, and then a strange gust of wind appeared. Despite the surrounding windows being closed, an unnatural force pushed Jane forward into the rift. In just a few seconds, she passed through an invisible barrier and vanished from sight. Seeing this, Syd's suspicions were confirmed. Without wasting time, he followed her, attempting to pass through the same invisible rift. However, something unexpected happened. Though he could sense the spatial anomaly with his hands, he found himself unable to pass through. Syd let out a cold chuckle. Unfazed, he reached to his waist and retrieved the Tesseract, which was wrapped in cloth. In an instant, the Tesseract emitted a radiant blue light. The small spatial rift before him rippled violently under the immense power of the Tesseract. With the might of the Tesseract's spatial manipulation, the barrier parted like water, revealing a darkened scene beyond. It was clear, the Tesseract had forcefully torn open the rift. After scanning the dim environment on the other side, Syd quietly stepped through. Inside the dark space, Jane was panicking, calling out Darcy's name as she stood lost and confused. At that moment, something caught her eye, a tall, rectangular stone with a glowing red light emanating from a crack in its center. Flowing red liquid pulsed within the crack, moving as if it were alive. Unable to resist her curiosity, Jane approached the stone. As soon as she got close, she was abruptly pulled against the stone's surface. The red liquid within the crack began to surge toward her, attempting to enter her body. Jane's face twisted in fear. Just when she thought things were about to go terribly wrong, a layer of red energy appeared between her and the ether. "What is this?" she whispered. Suddenly, she heard footsteps approaching. Instinctively, she turned around, and what she saw left her utterly shocked. A mysterious figure, dressed in black, was calmly walking toward her. Jane's eyes widened in disbelief. End of chapter. Chapter 209, Chapter 209. 1000 PS reached. Next goal, 1500 PS. Reviews, 104/120. The sound of footsteps made Jane's heart race. In this dark and eerie place, there was someone else. Who could it be? As she turned toward the sudden glow of red light, Jane's gaze locked onto the approaching figure, and her confusion quickly turned to shock. White Knight. What's he doing here? After the town battle and the events in New York, how could this mysterious figure suddenly appear in front of her now? Jane knew the White Knight wasn't just an ordinary person. He was rumored to be an Omega-level mutant, possibly even a god, with powers far beyond comprehension. For someone of such stature to show up in this desolate place was unbelievable to her. Jane was utterly stunned. On top of that, she quickly realized that the strange red light wasn't a random phenomenon but a direct result of the White Knight's powerful Omega abilities. It suddenly made sense to her why the ominous red liquid was being held back so effortlessly. While Jane was caught up in her thoughts, Syd had already approached her. He glanced at the chaotic ether that was relentlessly trying to break free from the barrier of his chaotic magic and merge with Jane. The ether, huh? With a wave of his right hand, the red liquid that had been trying to invade Jane's body was enveloped in a red energy sphere, drawn toward him. Jane watched in disbelief as the ether, previously swirling around uncontrollably, was now calmly suspended in front of the White Knight, contained within a ball of chaotic magic. Her mouth dropped open in shock. Syd, on the other hand, narrowed his eyes at the ether, which was still attempting to break free from its containment. Looks like I underestimated this thing, he thought to himself. Originally, Syd had considered allowing the ether to merge with him, just to see what would happen. But now, seeing how it struggled even within the magical sphere, he quickly dismissed that idea. Allowing the ether to enter his body seemed reckless, even for him. Who knew what kind of havoc it might cause? He wasn't confident that his current physical form, though enhanced, could withstand the full force of an Infinity Stone. If his Asgardian body and divine power were at their maximum levels, perhaps he'd feel more secure in attempting such a risk. But for now. With a flick of his wrist, the liquid form of the Reality Stone began to compress within the chaotic sphere. Under the immense pressure of his chaotic magic, the ether was forced to take a solid form. In both Syd's and Jane's stunned eyes, the liquid gradually solidified, releasing a blinding red glow. Finally, the light dimmed, revealing an irregularly shaped red gemstone hovering in midair. What is that? Jane gasped, covering her mouth in shock, her eyes flicking between the strange gem and the White Knight. Syd paid no attention to her. Instead, with a simple gesture, the now solidified Reality Stone floated into his palm. Holding the Reality Stone, he immediately established a connection with it. Curious to see the full extent of its power, Syd decided to test it. He envisioned a vast grassland, then channeled the stone's power to transform the dark and dreary surroundings into that peaceful scene. However, as soon as he issued the command, a sudden discomfort washed over him. He felt a corrosive force radiating from the stone, attempting to invade and damage his body. Fortunately, thanks to his level 4 Asgardian physique, coupled with his light power and divine abilities, the backlash wasn't enough to pose a serious threat to him. Of course, that was largely because he hadn't used the Reality Stone's full power. Additionally, Syd noticed a strong desire emanating from the stone. It was hungry for his light energy. After a brief moment of consideration, Syd decided not to resist. The Reality Stone absorbed nearly a fifth of his stored light energy. Then, something remarkable happened. In Jane's astonished eyes, the bleak, dim surroundings began to shift. The change was rapid, as if someone was painting a new landscape right before her eyes. In just 2 or 3 seconds, the desolate space had transformed into a lush, green grassland. Jane blinked, rubbing her eyes in disbelief, thinking it must be a trick. But after pinching her own face, she finally accepted the truth. Her wide-eyed gaze shifted to the White Knight, her mind reeling. Is this his Omega-level ability? It's terrifying. This defies the laws of physics, of science. How is he doing this? Jane could hardly comprehend what she was witnessing. In her mind, this bizarre and awe-inspiring event could only be the result of the White Knight's fabled ability to alter reality. After all, everyone knew that the White Knight possessed this extraordinary, reality-bending power. He had demonstrated it more than once. So, it was only natural for her to believe that this was his doing. As for the peculiar gemstone in his hand, Jane barely gave it a second thought. Who could imagine that a simple stone could wield such world-altering power? Syd, meanwhile, wasn't paying any attention to Jane's stunned reaction. He was more focused on the Reality Stone itself. So, the Reality Stone really does require energy to sustain its changes. He mused. At that moment, he realized why the Dark Elf in Thor, the Dark World, didn't simply use the ether to rewrite reality. It wasn't that the liquid form couldn't alter reality, it just required an enormous amount of energy to do so. The dark elf clearly didn't possess that kind of power. No wonder the Reality Stone is considered the hardest Infinity Stone to wield. It needs the support of the other stones. Reflecting on the large amount of energy he had just expended, Syd shook his head. How could any ordinary person hope to control the Reality Stone? Only with the assistance of the other Infinity Stones could the Reality Stone fully unleash its potential. The Power Stone, for instance, existed to supply energy to the others. In truth, the Infinity Stones were all interconnected, working best in unison. As Syd pondered these things, barely 10 seconds had passed before he noticed the surrounding landscape beginning to change. In the blink of an eye, the grassy fields reverted to their original dark and gloomy state. It was clear that any changes made by the Reality Stone were temporary. Altering reality in defiance of the natural order required a continuous supply of energy to maintain. The duration of these changes depended on how much energy was provided and the extent of the modifications made. These altered realities were like rootless water, they could only exist with constant energy input. However, Syd could sense that this wasn't the full story. Under the right circumstances, these temporary realities could be made permanent. With the combined power of all 6 Infinity Stones, these changes could last indefinitely, perhaps even becoming irreversible. End of chapter. Chapter 210, Chapter 210. Even Thanos needed the combined power of all 6 Infinity Stones to permanently erase half of the universe's population. After pondering for a moment, Syd silently evaluated, "It's decent, I guess." While the reality created by the Reality Stone didn't last long, it was incredibly useful in critical moments during a battle. For example, if a laser was fired at him, he could momentarily transform the laser into a flock of butterflies. Even if the butterflies reverted to lasers later, he would have long since moved away from the original position. All things considered, it's still not as powerful as chaos magic, Syd thought. Chaos magic can alter reality permanently, whereas this feels like a weaker version of it. He couldn't help but feel a bit unimpressed. Well, having it is better than not having it. At least chaos magic is unstable, and this can be actively controlled, even if the effects are short-lived. Glancing at the now restored surroundings and the stunned Jane nearby, Syd held the Reality Stone in his hand, his figure slowly rising into the air. He began floating toward a nearby space rift. Jane, regaining her senses, hesitated. She had no idea where she was or how to get out. Now, it seemed like the White Knight, after taking the strange red stone, was preparing to leave. After a brief moment of uncertainty, Jane made up her mind and followed behind him. Although too scared to speak to this terrifying figure, she mustered the courage to trail after him. Syd, of course, noticed Jane running behind him, but he didn't care much. He approached the space rift, took out the blue tesseract, and as the blue light flared, the rift widened quickly. The familiar sight of the abandoned factory appeared before him. In the next moment, Syd flew out of the rift. Seeing this, Jane, with a flash of hope in her eyes, hurriedly followed suit, exiting the rift just before it closed behind her. Syd glanced at her briefly but remained unconcerned, continuing to fly out of the factory. During his flight, he noticed Daisy and the intern frantically searching for Jane. Without acknowledging them, he soared out of the abandoned aerospace factory, disappearing into the distant sky, leaving the two staring after him in shock. It wasn't until his figure vanished from sight that Daisy and the intern regained their senses, their attention quickly shifting to Jane. "Jane, what happened? Where did you go? That was the White Knight, right? How did he end up with you?" Daisy, unable to contain her curiosity, bombarded Jane with rapid-fire questions. Under the puzzled gaze of Daisy and the intern, Jane thought for a moment and then recounted what had just transpired. "Oh my God, you went into some weird space. And you found a strange red liquid stone, then ran into the White Knight. And you witnessed the White Knight using his Omega-level mutant powers." Daisy and the intern were floored by Jane's recounting, trying to imagine the whirlwind of events she had experienced in such a short time. Jane nodded in confirmation, her expression still in awe as she reminisced. "You wouldn't believe what I saw. Daisy, you can't even imagine." Under the White Knight's power, the dilapidated surroundings instantly transformed into a beautiful grassland. I could even feel the texture of the grass and soil beneath my feet. I'm sure those grass and dirt were real. Daisy and the intern exchanged shocked glances, both trying to wrap their heads around Jane's description. After a moment, the intern sighed. That's the power of an Omega-level mutant. It's truly terrifying and awe-inspiring. Daisy, on the other hand, complained, Jane, how could you not capture that moment on video? If you had recorded that scene and uploaded it online, we'd be famous. While the three of them discussed the incredible events, elsewhere, powerful forces were awakening. In a distant galaxy, large asteroids floated through space, and among them was a massive, dark arrow-shaped ship. Not long after Syd claimed the ether, otherwise known as the Reality Stone, the dormant ship powered up. As the ship came out of standby mode, one of the armored suits within opened its visor. The occupant, a white-haired, pale-skinned dark elf with sharp, deep-set features, slowly opened his eyes. This was Malekith, leader of the Dark Elves and ruler of Svartalfheim, who had been defeated by the Asgardian army thousands of years ago. Malekith's heart was filled with burning hatred for both the Asgardians and Odin. For him, the Asgardians, who ruled over the 9 realms, were nothing but a thorn in his side, especially Odin, who had caused significant harm to the Dark Elf race during his conquest of the 9 realms in his youth. Malekith stepped out of his armor, surveying the other Dark Elves who were also beginning to awaken from stasis. His voice was cold as he spoke, the ether has awakened us, and the convergence has begun once more. As he said this, his eyes gleamed with anticipation. Once the realms aligned again, the fabric of space would become unstable, allowing for gateways and passages between worlds to open. When that happened, they could travel through the rifts and invade other realms. However, as Malekith was plotting his course of action, a flicker of confusion crossed his face. He realized that the convergence hadn't fully begun, it was merely in its early stages. This was far earlier than he had expected. Puzzled, Malekith dismissed the thought, assuming it was a coincidence. Soon, he began organizing his plans to retrieve the ether and invade Asgard. Meanwhile, in Asgard, Heimdall, the ever-vigilant guardian of the Bifrost, narrowed his golden eyes as he saw something unusual. With the Bifrost destroyed, Asgard's control over the realms had weakened. Heimdall had focused his attention on other realms, especially those like Svartalfheim, which had shown signs of rebellion. Just moments ago, he had witnessed Malekith and the other Dark Elves awakening from their slumber. Without a second thought, Heimdall turned and hurried toward the palace of Odin, the All-Father, to inform him of the impending danger. End of chapter. Chapter 211, Chapter 211. Soon, Heimdall arrived at the palace of King Odin. Your Majesty. Heimdall recounted everything he had witnessed. Hearing this, King Odin frowned, Malekith. Odin was neither completely surprised nor completely caught off guard by Malekith's rebellion. He had long predicted that the Dark Elves would rise again, but what surprised him was Heimdall's revelation that the ether had resurfaced. Knowing that the Dark Elves were awakened by the ether, Odin immediately deduced their intentions. It was the same as thousands of years ago, to use the ether to plunge the universe back into eternal darkness. Where is the ether now? Odin asked, looking toward Heimdall. Heimdall hesitated for a moment. After discovering Malekith's awakening, on his way to report to Odin, he had tried to locate the ether and check on Thor and the others. Since the ether was no longer hidden in a special space, he had easily pinpointed its location. The person possessing it was someone he had been watching closely, making it impossible for him not to notice. After thinking for a moment, Heimdall replied, "The ether is currently in Midgard, held by someone you're quite familiar with." He paused, seeing the surprise on Odin's face before continuing, "Moreover, it's not just the ether, the Tesseract is also in this person's possession." Upon hearing this, King Odin's face showed a flash of astonishment, and his brows furrowed tightly as his expression grew more serious. The Tesseract contained the Space Stone, which Odin knew well. Because of this, he was acutely aware of the dangers posed when multiple Infinity Stones came together. These stones were a source of disaster, countless beings across the universe sought them. If all 6 stones were united, it could trigger unimaginable catastrophes. No one understood this better than Odin. At one point, he had even considered collecting the stones himself. The Infinity Gauntlet in Asgard's treasure vault had been created for that very purpose. However, due to various reasons, Odin had abandoned the idea of collecting the stones, leaving the gauntlet with fake gems in the vault as a mere token of what could have been. Realizing how dangerous the stones were, Odin had even sent the Tesseract away from Asgard, leaving it on Earth. And now Heimdall was telling him that both the Tesseract and the Ether were in the possession of a single person. It was no wonder Odin was so shocked. "Who is it?" Odin asked gravely. He had momentarily overlooked Heimdall's mention that the person in question was someone he was familiar with. Heimdall hesitated again, then said, "It's with the White Knight." Odin's serious expression quickly turned to one of astonishment, his emotions becoming complicated. He was both shocked and surprised. Of course, Odin knew about the White Knight. After the young man lifted Thor's hammer, Odin had kept a close eye on him. However, Odin hadn't expected the Ether and the Tesseract to fall into that young man's hands. In the short time he hadn't been watching, such an extraordinary event had occurred. "Has Thor returned?" Odin asked. Heimdall shook his head in response, which didn't surprise Odin. He had only asked out of formality. Without the Tesseract, Thor was likely still stranded on Midgard. Not dwelling on the matter, Odin tightened his grip on the golden scepter in his hand. A terrifying surge of energy erupted from him. In the next moment, a brilliant beam of multicolored light shot out, headed straight for Earth. This was none other than the Rainbow Bridge's teleportation power. Despite the bridge itself being destroyed, Odin was still able to wield this power. Heimdall stood calmly by, watching the rainbow beam as it descended toward Earth, as though he could see exactly where it was headed. Earth, New York. Thor, currently resting at Stark's luxurious mansion, was feeling frustrated. He had been seeking Tony Stark's help, hoping there might be a way to return to Asgard. Suddenly, he froze and instinctively looked up. Boom. A rainbow-colored beam burst through the ceiling of Stark's mansion, engulfing Thor in its radiant light. Thor was dumbfounded, muttering, "The Rainbow Bridge? No, it's father." Realizing what was happening, Thor's face lit up with excitement. He turned to the bewildered Tony Stark and exclaimed, "Ha ha! I can finally go BA." Before he could finish his sentence, Thor vanished along with the beam of light, leaving behind a complex rune pattern etched into Stark's floor. God damn it. Stark swore as he stared at the hole in his mansion's ceiling and the damaged floor where Thor had stood. His expression turned serious. Why had Thor suddenly been summoned back to Asgard? Had something happened in the divine realm? As Stark pondered this, the appearance of the rainbow-colored beam did not go unnoticed by others. Several civilians witnessed the event firsthand, and S.H.I.E.L.D.'s instruments had also detected the powerful energy. Even Syd, who was a fair distance away, quickly noticed the familiar energy surge, his connection to Asgard making him especially sensitive to it. "That's the Rainbow Bridge's energy beam." Syd was taken aback but quickly pieced together what had likely happened. Currently, the Rainbow Bridge was still destroyed, as the Tesseract, needed to repair it, was still in his possession. As for this similar teleportation energy, Syd immediately understood. It was Odin's doing. Syd wasn't particularly surprised. After all, the Rainbow Bridge had two meanings. It referred both to the teleportation device and to the ability itself. The ability to summon the Rainbow Bridge was an extension of Odin's power, or more precisely, a part of Asgard's divine heritage. For Thor, this divine power manifested as his lightning abilities. Even without the Rainbow Bridge device, the power of the Rainbow Bridge could still be used, by either Odin or Thor. Even Heimdall, the guardian of the Bifrost, could use it, as he had been granted access to Odin's power, allowing him to invoke the Rainbow Bridge's teleportation. End of chapter. Chapter 212, Chapter 212. 1500 PS reached. Reviews, 106/120. As for the Rainbow Bridge, it's essentially a simplified, more stable version of the ability, turning it into a daily use device. Of course, there's a difference. The Rainbow Bridge device consumes less energy and can continually channel enough power to destroy planets. I wonder if I have the ability to use Rainbow Bridge teleportation. Syd mused with curiosity. However, since he didn't know exactly how it was used and lacked a tool like the King's Scepter or Thor's Stormbreaker, it seemed impossible for him to utilize it at the moment. While Syd pondered, over at the Asgardian royal palace, a strong figure appeared, Thor. As soon as he landed, Thor exclaimed excitedly, "Father, Heimdall, I'm finally back. I thought I'd be stuck in Midgard forever, never to see you again." Before he could continue his joyous rambling, Odin frowned and sternly interrupted, "Enough." Startled, Thor quickly stopped, looking at his father with confusion. What was going on with Odin today? Could it be, was this what Midgardians call midlife crisis? Thor, tell me everything that has happened to you during your time in Midgard, Odin demanded. Thor, now more alert, began to recount his experiences on Earth, from his fight with Iron Man, Captain America, and the others to his encounter with the White Knight. He mentioned how the White Knight had used Mjolnir and displayed divine powers, which led Thor to suspect that he might be his brother. As Thor spoke, he glanced suspiciously at his father, searching for any reaction. It was truly divine power. Heimdall reacted with shock. Long ago, Heimdall had sensed something akin to divine power emanating from the White Knight but hadn't been certain. Now, hearing Thor's words confirmed his earlier suspicions. If the White Knight indeed possessed divine power, it explained why he could wield Mjolnir. Heimdall, grappling with this revelation, asked cautiously, "Are you certain it wasn't a mistake?" Before Thor could answer, footsteps echoed through the room. The three turned to see Queen Frigga entering. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Sensing the tension and having overheard part of the conversation, Frigga asked, "Divine power? What were you talking about?" Even Odin seemed momentarily at a loss for words, not knowing how to explain things to Frigga. Seeing Odin's discomfort, Frigga turned to her son. Thor. Feeling cornered, Thor hesitated for a few seconds before timidly saying, "Well, mother, it's like this." After recounting everything to Frigga, her expression shifted slightly, and she instinctively looked toward Odin, who was visibly uneasy under her gaze. "Are you certain there was no mistake?" Frigga asked, her tone full of skepticism. Thor vigorously shook his head. "No, absolutely not. I could clearly sense it, he has divine power, and it's not something any ordinary Asgardian possesses." While speaking, Thor snuck a quick, furtive glance at Odin, hoping Frigga didn't notice. Sensing the growing awkwardness, Heimdall quickly shifted the conversation to avoid further tension. "So, he defeated you effortlessly?" Heimdall asked. Everyone's attention turned to Thor again. Looking slightly dejected, Thor nodded and said, "Father, Mother, Heimdall, you have no idea how powerful he is. It only took a single exchange, and I was completely overpowered. His strength was overwhelming. My human friends and I were all defeated in an instant, and we felt powerless against him. And he could summon Mjolnir and even wield it better than I can." Thor added, sounding even more downhearted. As Thor recounted his defeat, Frigga looked shocked, while both Odin and Heimdall's expressions grew more complex. They knew well how formidable Thor was, he was one of the mightiest warriors in Asgard. For him to be defeated so easily by someone else was astonishing. Although they hadn't witnessed the battle firsthand, just imagining it was enough to understand how one-sided and overwhelming it must have been. Moreover, Thor had mentioned that others were present, beings who, in his words, could hold their own against him for several rounds. Yet, they too had been bested in a single strike. Suddenly, Thor remembered something and turned to his father. "Oh, right, father. He mentioned something about the Rune King Thor. He said that if I could comprehend the power of the runes and awaken my divine powers, combining them, I could become a true god. He called it the Rune King Thor," Thor said, still unsure if the White Knight had been serious or just making casual remarks. However, the moment Thor spoke those words, both Odin and Frigga's expressions shifted noticeably. A brief silence followed before Odin admitted, "Thor, if you truly follow his advice, you could indeed become a true god." Odin's eyes now gleamed with anticipation as he looked at his son. "What?" Thor was taken aback, staring at his father in disbelief. Did this mean the White Knight had been telling the truth all along? He hadn't been lying. Thor was stunned. He knows so much. It's incredible. Is there anything he doesn't know? The idea that becoming Rune King Thor was real left Thor both awestruck and amazed. End of chapter. Chapter 213, Chapter 213. Thor continued to recount his experiences, explaining how the White Knight had effortlessly ignored their attacks due to his powerful body. This left Odin, Frigga, and Heimdall in a state of disbelief. The Asgardian gods had incredibly strong bodies, but from Thor's description, it was clear that the White Knight's physical strength far surpassed even Thor's. The three of them exchanged surprised glances. Thor then went on to describe the mysterious divine power he had witnessed during the battle. "At first, I didn't recognize him until I saw the red light emanating from his hand," he recalled, looking at Odin with growing concern. "Father, he was able to wield Mjolnir, and he possesses divine power. I think he's connected to our royal family." Both Heimdall and Frigga turned their attention to Odin, who was visibly uncomfortable, unsure of what to make of this claim. Thor continued, recounting the most significant event, the Battle of New York. At first, Odin, Frigga, and Heimdall weren't particularly surprised by Thor's account of the early stages of the battle. It all seemed fairly standard. However, when Thor described the human-made machines that resembled destroyer-like battle armor, their expressions changed. These machines were immensely powerful, Thor explained. Although individually weaker than the destroyer, there were so many of them that they posed a significant threat. Odin, Frigga, and Heimdall were shocked. Humans had developed such powerful weapons. Although they weren't overly concerned, Odin knew that if humanity had created something this advanced, it was worth noting. However, he also believed that Asgardian technology could easily surpass such inventions if they wished. But when Thor mentioned how a single individual had effortlessly destroyed all these powerful machines in an instant, their shock deepened. "Who was it?" Odin asked, his curiosity piqued. "It was the White Knight," Thor revealed, a smile forming on his face. At the mention of the White Knight, Frigga and Odin were taken aback. They had known he was powerful, but to dismantle hundreds of advanced robots in mere moments was beyond their expectations. "How did he do it?" Frigga asked, struggling to comprehend. Thor explained excitedly, "The robots turned into sand, and then the sand transformed into butterflies. The sky was filled with butterflies. You can't imagine how incredible it was. And those butterflies were alive, made of silicon but still living creatures." Frigga, Odin, and Heimdall were left in stunned silence. Sand into butterflies. Living, silicon-based life forms. It sounded absurd, but Thor's enthusiasm made it clear he wasn't exaggerating. "He really did that?" Frigga asked incredulously. Thor nodded, recalling how everyone present had been left in awe by the transformation. He further elaborated on how the White Knight had performed other feats, like turning energy into matter, converting crystals into water, and erasing entire groups of robots from existence. The ability to alter matter, to create and destroy. Thor's voice trailed off, the sheer scope of the White Knight's powers finally sinking in. Even Odin, who had seen and experienced countless incredible things, was visibly shaken. At first, he suspected the White Knight was wielding the power of the Reality Stone, but something didn't add up. The timeline was wrong, and the effects Thor described didn't match the Reality Stone's typical limitations. The Reality Stone could alter reality, but only for a short period. To make such changes permanent would require immense energy and possibly other Infinity Stones. Even then, it was not a simple task. Odin had experience with the Reality Stone and knew its strengths and limitations. What Thor described wasn't temporary, it was lasting. This suggested that the White Knight's power wasn't coming from the Reality Stone. The realization hit Odin, this wasn't the power of the stone, it was the White Knight's own strength. The possibility that the White Knight's abilities were greater than those of the Reality Stone left Odin in awe. "He's even more powerful than I imagined," Odin thought. Frigga, equally shocked, asked, "Thor, are you sure about all of this?" Thor nodded earnestly and then added, "Oh, and he also mentioned something about the Infinity Stones. He said that at the beginning of the universe, there were 6 of them." As Thor finished recounting the White Knight's knowledge of the Infinity Stones, Odin's expression became even more serious. The fact that the White Knight possessed such immense power was alarming enough, but the knowledge of the Infinity Stones made things even more concerning. From Thor's words, Odin realized that the White Knight not only had the Tesseract but also the scepter containing the Mind Stone. And now, with the emergence of the Ether, he had 3 Infinity Stones in his possession. 3 out of 6. Odin's face grew increasingly grim as he processed this revelation. One individual now held half of the universe's most powerful artifacts. If the White Knight held this much power, Odin understood the potential dangers that could arise. "A man with 3 Infinity Stones," Odin muttered gravely. "The consequences could be unimaginable." End of chapter. Chapter 214, Chapter 214. As Odin was deep in thought, Thor quickly finished recounting the events of the Battle of New York and moved on to the matter he was most eager to discuss. Not long after the Battle of New York, Nick Fury, the director of S.H.I.E.L.D., approached me and told me about the God of Light, Thor said, cautiously eyeing his father. The god of light. Heimdall interjected, sounding surprised and confused. He couldn't recall any mention of a god of light in Asgardian lore. Thor nodded. Yes, and the light phenomenon that covered Jotunheim, Midgard, Asgard, and even other realms, it's all connected to this god of light. This revelation stunned everyone. Odin, who had been sitting on his throne, stood up abruptly. Thor, explain yourself. Odin demanded. Who is this god of light you're talking about? The light phenomenon that had spread across the 9 realms was unprecedented. The mere thought that it was caused by one individual was hard to fathom, even for the powerful king of Asgard. Odin's face grew tense as he contemplated the sheer magnitude of power needed to cover the 9 realms with light. Such strength was beyond imagination. He couldn't help but take the matter seriously. Frigga and Heimdall, both realizing the gravity of the situation, exchanged worried glances. Frigga, in particular, had always sensed something during the phenomenon, an inexplicable connection between herself and the event. She had even questioned Odin about it afterward, but they had found no answers. Thor took a deep breath before finally revealing the identity of the mysterious god of light. The god of light is none other than the White Knight, Thor declared. In the mouths of his followers, he is called Balder, and in human mythology, he is said to be the second son of you and mother, my brother. The room fell into stunned silence. The White Knight was the god of light. The same being responsible for the light phenomenon across the 9 realms. Odin, Frigga, and Heimdall were shocked beyond words. Not only did the White Knight possess the power to alter reality, but now it seemed he also had control over such an immense force that could affect the 9 realms. Heimdall's expression froze as he processed what Thor had said. Was it true that Odin and Frigga had another son, a brother of Thor? When did this happen, he wondered. As Heimdall struggled to comprehend the situation, he noticed that Odin and Frigga were looking at each other in shock and confusion. Neither of them seemed to know what Thor was talking about. Odin clenched his staff tightly, his mind racing. Could it be that he had a son he wasn't aware of, a son who was this powerful? It made no sense to him, and he even considered that Thor might be mistaken. However, before Odin could voice his thoughts, Frigga spoke first, her voice filled with certainty. I believe it, she said, much to everyone's surprise. He is my son, and Thor's brother. Odin and Thor were taken aback, while Heimdall looked on, trying to piece things together. Frigga's certainty was unwavering as she continued, the light phenomenon, it was him. Frigga explained the strong sense of connection she had felt during the light event, and how everything suddenly made sense. Her words left Odin stunned, and Thor overjoyed. Heimdall, on the other hand, felt that everything was starting to fall into place. This can't be, Odin began, still unsure. Frigga, you know we never had. But Frigga interrupted, speaking with an unshakable conviction. I know what I felt, and I know he is my son. Listening to her unwavering belief, even Odin, who had been adamant moments before, began to waver. Could Frigga really be right? Had he somehow forgotten or overlooked the existence of this powerful child? The room fell silent as everyone grappled with Frigga's declaration. Odin, now visibly conflicted, finally spoke again. We will know for certain when we meet him ourselves, he said, still holding on to a sliver of doubt. He wanted to see the White Knight with his own eyes. Only then would he be able to tell if this mysterious figure was truly his son. The godly aura, the divine energy, Odin was confident he would recognize it immediately if it was indeed his child. As Odin tried to make sense of it all, he refrained from dampening Frigga's spirits. She was too convinced, and Odin decided it was best to wait until they could confirm things for themselves. Frigga, on the other hand, was full of hope and excitement. She eagerly anticipated the day she would meet this son she believed was hers. She turned back to Thor and said, "Tell me more about what's happened since then." While Frigga and Thor continued to talk, in the distant Dark Elf realm, Malekith was holding a meeting with his fellow Dark Elves. "Are you sure the ether is in Midgard?" Malekith asked, his eyes gleaming with malice. A Dark Elf clad in black armor nodded firmly. "Yes, we have confirmed it. The ether is in Midgard." A sinister smile spread across Malekith's face. He knew exactly where Midgard was, it was the realm of humans. If the ether was on Midgard, it would be an easy target. If the ether had been in Asgard, it would have been much more difficult to retrieve. But on a weak planet like Midgard, taking it would be a simple task. Once I have the ether in my hands, the Asgardians, and especially Odin, will pay for what they've done, Malekith said with a cold laugh. End of chapter. Chapter 215, Chapter 215. In the dark realm of Svartalfheim, Malekith and the Dark Elves were ready to set their plan into motion. Having confirmed that the ether was on Earth, they decided to forego a direct assault on Asgard. Instead, they chose to infiltrate Earth, bypassing Asgard's defenses for now, intending to retrieve the ether before confronting the Asgardians. The Dark Elves headed to a weak point in the space between realms, a convergence zone that would allow them to slip into Earth's atmosphere unnoticed. As the massive, shadowy ship floated at the convergence point, Malekith and his warriors felt confident. This had been part of their plan for millennia, and now, with the proper technology, they would penetrate Earth's atmosphere. Earth, early morning in London, Greenwich. High in the sky, cloaked in invisibility, the cross-shaped dark elf warship entered Earth's atmosphere. After a brief moment of hovering, the ship sped off toward New York City, where the ether was located. The city of New York was still in the process of rebuilding from previous attacks, and construction workers and civilians alike stopped in their tracks, looking skyward with growing dread. Emerging from its cloaked state, the massive black and gray warship slowly became visible. Panic quickly ensued. New Yorkers, veterans of alien invasions, immediately recognized the advanced technology and began to flee. Screams filled the streets as people ran for their lives, fearing another invasion. Malekith and his warriors inside the ship were briefly confused by the sight of humans fleeing with such familiarity, but they were uninterested in dealing with what they saw as weak, inferior beings. A hidden corner of New York. Syd lifted his head, his sharp vision easily picking out the massive dark elf ship in the sky. A knowing expression crossed his face. So, the Dark Elves and Malekith have finally come for the ether, he muttered to himself, not at all surprised by their arrival. SHIELD headquarters. At the same time, SHIELD sensors detected the ship. Agents scrambled to relay the information. Director, we've detected an unidentified craft. It's not from any known Earth-based civilization, a SHIELD agent reported. Nick Fury's face darkened further. Damn these aliens, they're getting bolder by the day, he growled. Then, without hesitation, he barked orders. Get the message to the Avengers, and bring me the Chitauri commander now. Stark Tower, New York. Within moments, Tony Stark, Captain America, and the rest of the Avengers received the urgent call. Tony, located right in the heart of New York, was the first to react. Great. Just what we needed, more uninvited guests, Tony muttered under his breath as he suited up. With a burst of thrusters, his Iron Man armor blazed through the sky toward the alien ship. The Dark Elf warship. As the ship descended into New York, it caused destruction in its path, crushing buildings and cracking the ground beneath it. The Dark Elves emerged from the ship, their sleek gray-black suits and energy weapons giving them an imposing presence. Find the ether, Malekith commanded, his voice filled with confidence. The Dark Elves spread out, methodically searching for the ether. Malekith himself stepped out of the ship, scanning the area with disdain for the terrified humans. Nothing will stand in my way, he declared. At that moment, a red and gold armored figure streaked across the sky, hovering just above the scene. Stop right there. Tony Stark called out, his voice amplified through his suit. So, which backwater part of the universe did you crawl out of this time? End of chapter. Chapter 216, Chapter 216. 500 PS reached. Next goal, 1000 PS. Reviews, 110/120. Just as he stepped out, Malekith, with his white hair, pale skin, and blue eyes, glanced at the flying armor in the sky with a hint of surprise. Midgardians have such technology. Though he was a bit taken aback, he didn't dwell on it. With a casual wave of his hand, the Dark Elves in black and gray armor raised their energy guns and began shooting at Tony's flying figure. Swish swish swish. Red energy blasts streaked across the sky. Despite being prepared, Tony Stark dodged several shots, but even he couldn't escape every attack. Finally, a red energy blast struck him, sending him flying backward. The power of these red blasts was substantial. Occasionally, when they hit a building, they left massive craters, far more destructive than the Chitauri's energy weapons. Watching Iron Man get blown back, the Dark Elves sneered. "Humans, they think they can stop us." At the same time, Pepper Potts, witnessing this from a screen, felt her heart tighten, praying desperately. Nick Fury from S.H.I.E.L.D. also saw the scene and immediately turned to interrogate the newly captured Chitauri commander. "Are those your people? You Chitauri haven't given up, and now you're trying to invade Earth again." The Chitauri commander froze under Fury's questioning and denied, "Those aren't Chitauri. You can tell just by looking at them." "Then who are they?" Fury asked, feigning anger as his eyes flickered with suspicion. The Chitauri commander, not noticing Fury's subtle tactics, stared at the screen before hesitating. "They should be Dark Elves." "Dark Elves?" After a brief explanation from the Chitauri commander, he said, "It looks like these Dark Elves are searching for something." "Their objective?" Fury's eyes flashed as he scrutinized the satellite images, noticing that the Dark Elves were indeed searching for something while blasting anyone who didn't cooperate. Occasionally, they threw bizarre bombs that engulfed anything nearby upon detonation. The mere sight of these weapons sent a chill down Fury's spine. Thankfully, Tony Stark was still fighting the Dark Elves, though his armor was taking damage from the continuous assaults. Seeing Tony slowly losing ground, Fury's expression darkened. Tony couldn't hold out forever. But just as things seemed dire, a green figure appeared, instantly relieving Tony's burden and giving Fury some relief. On the battlefield. Hulk. Seeing the rampaging green giant, Tony felt a wave of joy. Malekith, noticing the green giant from afar, was visibly surprised. Midgard has such monsters. He was astonished. In his mind, Earth was supposed to be a weak planet, yet here was such a formidable being. Then, the red figure buzzing around like a fly asked Malekith who he was and what he wanted. Malekith waved his hand, signaling his Dark Elves to cease fire. Though he could deal with these two, he preferred to delay. He hadn't anticipated facing this scenario and didn't bring a large army. Now, he was secretly calling for reinforcements. Soon, more Dark Elves would arrive with additional ships. Then, he'd see how these humans could stop him from finding the ether. Malekith sneered. "I am the king of Svartalfheim," he said slowly. "I've come to your world seeking the ether. Surrender it, and we will leave at once." The ether? What ether? Neither Tony nor Fury had any idea what Malekith was talking about. However, the Chitauri commander's eyes flashed with realization. It seems the reality stone has surfaced. A grin spread across his face as he envisioned Thanos obtaining the reality stone. He began scheming on how to sneak away and deliver the news to his master. As their thoughts diverged, Malekith, seeing the humans' confusion, projected an image of the ether in the sky. A swirling dark liquid with a crimson hue flowed through the projection, exuding an eerie presence. "That's the ether." Tony frowned, pondering what it was and why the aliens were after it. "The ether once belonged to us Dark Elves. It was lost in Midgard," Malekith explained. "I can sense it nearby. Human, it's in your best interest not to hinder us. Once we find it, we will leave." Tony hesitated for a moment. Just then, Captain America arrived, asking, "What's going on?" Tony briefly summarized the situation while keeping a wary eye on the Dark Elves. Malekith didn't rush them. He watched quietly, indifferent to the gathering humans. What could a swarm of ants do? If he wanted, he could destroy them all with ease. Moreover, he was content to wait. Whether these weaklings surrendered the ether or whether his army arrived, he would obtain it either way. Malekith believed that once his ships descended, no amount of human resistance could stop him. As time passed, more Avengers arrived, Hawkeye, Black Widow, and even some lesser-known heroes from the civilian ranks. When they had all gathered, Malekith's reinforcements finally arrived. Tony Stark and the others looked up, their expressions grim. Several small warships decloaked, revealing themselves in the sky. "Humans, you cannot stop this," Malekith said calmly, staring at Tony Stark. Tony and the others' faces darkened further. Suddenly. Boom. A rainbow-colored beam shot down from the sky. "What? That's..." The Avengers lit up with hope while Malekith and the Dark Elves scowled. "The Bifrost," Malekith muttered. End of chapter. Chapter 217, Chapter 217. Seeing the colorful beam not far away, Malekith's face darkened. There was no need to guess, Asgard had sent someone. Sure enough, as the light faded, a muscular figure holding a silver hammer appeared before them. Thor. Hawkeye and the others were overjoyed. Thor nodded, then turned to face Malekith and the other dark elves in the distance, saying in a deep voice, "Malekith, leave Earth with your people. You're not welcome here." "As long as you hand over the ether, we will leave," Malekith replied. Before Tony and the others could ask Thor what the ether was, Thor instinctively refused. "That won't happen. The ether is in my brother's hands now. It doesn't belong to you, it belongs to my brother." The moment those words left his mouth, Malekith and the other dark elves were stunned. Brother. Malekith was no stranger to the Asgardian before him, he knew this guy was Odin's son. "Your brother, that Loki fellow? The ether is with him?" Malekith asked in surprise. "No, it's with my other brother." Thor said proudly, "I suggest you leave while you can. With my brother's strength, there's no way you can take the ether from him. Spare yourself the embarrassment." Upon hearing this, Malekith felt relieved. Finally, he knew where the ether was. He then looked at Thor strangely, as if watching a joke unfold. The other dark elves shared his sentiment, amused by Thor's words. This son of Odin was actually advising them to leave. Claiming that with his brother's strength, they wouldn't be able to take the ether. Spare themselves embarrassment. How laughable. They thought that this Asgardian must be an idiot. With their gathered army, even if the Allfather Odin were here, he might have to think twice, let alone this so-called brother of Thor's. If that brother showed up, they would teach him a lesson immediately, make him fear them, and obediently hand over the ether. But who exactly was this brother Thor was talking about? While Malekith and the Dark Elves were trying to figure out who this other brother was, Tony Stark, Captain America, and the others had some guesses. The next second, Captain America asked in surprise, "Thor, are you talking about the white-clad hero?" From what they knew, other than Loki, the only person suspected to be Thor's brother was that mysterious white-clad hero. Sure enough, under everyone's gaze, Thor nodded. Seeing him nod, Tony Stark and the others were stunned. The next second, they looked at Malekith with peculiar expressions. Some civilian superheroes, along with some onlookers in the distance, began whispering among themselves. Are these aliens crazy, picking a fight with the white-clad hero? They still want to take something from him. Oh my god, I thought I misheard. Hearing the distant murmurs of the humans, Malekith and the other dark elves were taken aback. What were these weak humans saying? They dared utter such words. With such a massive army, how could they fail to take something from one person? These ignorant, weak humans surely didn't think that the dark elves were as weak as they were, did they? Ridiculous. Even more absurd was the idea that a single individual could stand against their entire army. Malekith found it laughable, and so did the other dark elves. Casting a glance at Thor, Malekith decided to ignore him and called out, "The one carrying the ether, I know you're nearby." Tony and the others were stunned. The white-clad hero was nearby. Just as they were thinking this, the sound of footsteps suddenly echoed. What? Everyone, including Malekith, turned to look. Besides those present, Nick Fury and others at S.H.I.E.L.D., as well as Odin, Heimdall, and others silently observing from Asgard, all noticed the scene. A figure in white slowly emerged from the shadows in the distance. Tony and the others recognized the figure. It really is the white-clad hero. An Omega-level mutant. At that moment, whether it was Tony, other superheroes, or Nick Fury and his team, they were all shocked. This matter was indeed related to the white-clad hero, and he was actually nearby. In Asgard, within the throne room. Using Odin's power, an image appeared in the palace, reflecting the scene near Thor. At this moment, Odin, sitting on the throne, looked at the figure in white with complex emotions, while Frigga's eyes were filled with hope. Unfortunately, since it was just an image and the distance was too great, they couldn't sense the presence, divine bloodline, or divine power of the figure. These things could only be verified when the person appeared before them in the flesh. For now, all they could do was watch. Despite this, Frigga felt a tinge of concern. That child. With so many dark elves, and Malekith himself present, could the child really handle it? Odin noticed her concern and gave her a reassuring look, signaling that he would intervene if the child were in danger. Under the eyes of many, Syd slowly walked out. Seeing his figure, Malekith and the dark elves in the distance looked surprised. "Are you Thor's brother, the white-clad hero?" Malekith stared sharply at the figure before him, his voice cold. "Asgardian, hand over the ether. If you don't, you won't like the consequences." Malekith waved his hand. In the next second, the warships in the sky and the dark elves raised their energy guns, aiming straight at Syd. Seeing this, Syd remained calm, silently watching. Though he showed no response, the others were alarmed. If these guys attacked, wouldn't the entire ground be ripped apart? Seeing that the figure in white had no intention of handing over the ether, Malekith's expression turned cold. "Eliminate him." With those words, the air filled with the roar of weapons. Boom, boom, boom. Red energy blasts and laser beams were fired at Syd. Seeing this, Tony and the others were startled. End of chapter. Chapter 218. Chapter 218. For a moment, the entire sky was almost completely covered by red energy blasts and laser beams. All of these attacks were aimed at the figure in white in the distance. Tony and the others were stunned as they watched. Especially since the white-clad hero made no move to defend himself. Captain America and the others were bewildered. Malekith and the other dark elves, on the other hand, were filled with confidence. If so many attacks hit, even if that guy was Asgardian, he'd be left bloodied and lying on the ground. They could almost see it now, the men in white, screaming in agony, dying under the countless attacks. However, just as Tony Stark and the others were shocked, and Malekith and the dark elves were smiling, what happened next left them all in disbelief. Boom, boom, boom. Countless red energy blasts and laser beams continuously struck the white-clad figure. Yet, as they approached him, they transformed. Each red energy blast and laser beam turned into a colorful bubble. For a moment, Malekith and the others felt as if they were holding toy guns instead of energy weapons. How is this possible? Malekith was shocked. In the distance, Tony Stark and the others, including Thor, were also stunned. Did they just turn into bubbles? What just happened? Am I hallucinating? Wait, are they using toy weapons now? As if responding to their thoughts, a red glow flashed, and an incredible scene unfolded. The energy guns in Malekith and the Dark Elves' hands all turned into children's toy guns. Fuck. Seeing those toy guns, Tony and the others couldn't help but feel a sense of familiarity, like they'd seen them in the hands of kids before. This mind-boggling scene left many people with their mouths agape. Among the crowd, Captain America seemed to realize something and murmured, "Is this the white-clad hero's Omega-level mutant ability? It's still just as terrifying." Hearing Captain America's words, Natasha and the others were suddenly enlightened and utterly shocked. How many times had it been now? No matter how many times they saw it, the reality-warping power before them never ceased to amaze. Such power was truly terrifying. S.H.I.E.L.D. Director Nick Fury was astounded. This power, can it be used freely? He found it unbelievable. Initially, he thought that the white-clad hero's power must have some limitations. But this scene seemed to shatter his assumptions. This white-clad hero seemed capable of using this reality-defying, almost divine power at will. On the other hand, the Chitauri commander seemed to have thought of something, but his face remained full of shock. The ether, the reality stone. Impossible. The ether alone, without the gauntlet and the power stone, couldn't possibly be used to warp reality like this. The reality stone was powerful, but the cost of using it was unimaginable. Therefore, he believed that the power they were witnessing wasn't from the reality stone. After all, this kind of reality-warping ability was something the white-clad hero already possessed. Is it his ability again? The Chitauri commander was filled with disbelief. On the scene, the Dark Elves were in turmoil as they looked at the toy guns in their hands. Malekith was initially shocked, then realized something, and asked in disbelief, "The ether? Did you use the ether?" "Impossible, Asgardian. Where did you get such vast energy to power the ether?" If the ether, the reality stone, was really so easy to use without any limits, he would have long since used it to annihilate Asgard. He wouldn't have lost to the gods of Asgard. So, his heart was filled with doubt. Before he could get an answer from the white-clad figure, someone else in the distance responded first. What is this guy talking about? What ether? Isn't this the white-clad hero's Omega ability? No matter how many times I see it, it's still terrifying. Listening to their discussions, Malekith was dumbfounded. What? Omega ability? What are you weak humans talking about? Omega ability. This is clearly the power of the ether. Tony and the others were puzzled, not understanding why this alien was mistaking the white-clad hero's Omega ability for the power of the ether. At that moment, holding Mjolnir, Thor explained, the ether is the reality stone, one of the infinity stones. Before I came, my father told me about it. Apparently, it can alter reality. Infinity stone. So that's what it is. When Thor said that, Tony and the others immediately understood. After the Battle of New York, they had heard the white-clad hero mention the Infinity Stones. Among the 6 stones, one of them was the Reality Stone. While thinking about it, they cast surprised glances at the white-clad hero. Could it be that the white-clad hero can change reality because of that stone? That's quite unexpected. Just as they were thinking this, Thor shook his head and said, even before the Reality Stone surfaced, my brother could already alter reality. And for the Reality Stone to alter reality, it requires immense energy, and it cannot make permanent changes. For example, that butterfly earlier, if it had been changed by the Reality Stone, it would have reverted by now. It wouldn't have stayed as it is, let alone have life. I only know this because my father told me. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known either. Hearing this, Tony and the others were shocked. So that was the truth? They thought. In S.H.I.E.L.D., Nick Fury overheard this through the equipment, and his eyes showed a hint of disappointment. Damn it, what kind of monster was this? A power even scarier than an Infinity Stone, which had limitless energy. Nick Fury couldn't help but think of the Tesseract, but the thought alone made his scalp tingle, and he became even more wary of the white-clad hero. On the scene, Malekith and the Dark Elves' faces kept changing as they listened to the humans in the distance. Impossible. Son of Odin, what nonsense are you spouting? This is clearly the power of the ether. Malekith refused to believe that this reality-warping power was something the white-clad figure possessed by himself. Or rather, the fear in his heart made him unwilling to accept this answer. If what Odin's son said was true, then the power of the white-clad figure before him would be comparable to, or even surpass, the ether. If that were true, how terrifying would that be? Chapter 219, Chapter 219. 1000 PS reached. Next goal, 1500 PS. Malekith didn't want to believe it. However, even with the ether alone, judging by the current display, they likely weren't a match for him. The thought made his chest heave. An Asgardian using something that belonged to the Dark Elves against them. Without the ether, he'd like to see what this person could do against them. He could already imagine the sight of that man, powerless without the ether, being tortured and screaming in agony. Malekith thought bitterly. Just as he was thinking this, the sunlight in the sky suddenly twisted and became abnormal. What? The scope was so wide that even Malekith, who was lost in thought and filled with unwillingness, immediately noticed the anomaly. In his shocked gaze, as well as in Tony and the others' astonished eyes, the sunlight in their line of sight completely twisted. Next, the sky abruptly darkened, becoming pitch black. Endless sunlight condensed into a beam. Boom. The moment it condensed, the ground below was vaporized, disappearing without a trace. Noticing this, Tony murmured, "This sunlight beam must be at least 3,000 degrees or more." 3,000 degrees or more. Captain America and the others were shaken. If they didn't understand what that temperature meant before, now. Seeing the soil vanish, vaporized into nothingness, everyone felt a chill in their hearts. If it hit a person, the injury would be unimaginable. They wouldn't even need to pay for cremation. And the culprit responsible for all this? Everyone's gaze shifted over. The originally standing Syd now had a glowing red ball floating in his hand. He slightly raised his hand, and the beam of light in the distance stiffened before scattering in an instant. Under the gaze of Tony, Malekith, and others, the dispersed beam transformed into threads of light, quickly converging into his hand. The sky remained dark, with only his hand glowing. The endless light and heat were condensed into that glowing sphere, almost none of it dispersing, extremely concentrated. Syd hovered in the air, holding what seemed like a miniature sun. The sun shone with a blinding brilliance, and he appeared like a sun god. This guy. Malekith couldn't believe it. Just from a simple sense of the sun in his hand, Malekith felt suffocated. Not just him, the other dark elves felt the same way. Even Hawkeye and the others in the distance felt their hearts racing. As if sensing the tense atmosphere, Thor awkwardly tried to break the tension with a laugh. Haha, didn't I tell you? My brother, he's the god of light, he's. He trailed off. Even among gods, wasn't his brother a bit too exaggerated? So exaggerated that it made him question everything. Listening to Thor's explanation, everyone around felt even more nervous instead of relieved. What was Thor saying, god of light? To hell with the god of light. What kind of god of light was this absurd? They didn't dare imagine if that sun came toward them. With that thought, some of them began to run, desperately trying to flee. As they fled, Syd continued to float in the air, the breeze gently rustling his collar. At this moment, he looked like a true god, holding a sun, contemplating whether or not to destroy all life. Boom, boom, boom. In the sky, the unaffected warships couldn't stand it anymore and launched attacks together. Countless energy blasts, laser beams, and even black hole bombs were fired at him. Unfortunately, no matter the attack, they all turned into bubbles as they approached. Sensing the continuous depletion of light energy from altering reality with the reality stone, and the sun in his hand nearing its control limit, Syd glanced at Malekith and the others in the distance. Considering he might not be able to completely eliminate the enemy, he injected a large amount of light energy, or divine light, into the sun. The next second, he moved his right hand slightly. In the widened eyes of Malekith and his men, and the stunned gazes of the fleeing Tony and others, the blinding light shone, engulfing Malekith and his followers as they fled. Without a sound, the light covered everything. No. Gazing at the light that enveloped everything, Malekith felt the crisis of life and death. But no matter how he resisted, it was useless, the sunlight exceeded his limits. It was like being on the surface of the sun, the terrifying heat incinerating every dark elf, every warship, and him. The dark elves enveloped in light were filled with regret and fear, their thoughts chaotic, screams echoing. Midgard, has someone this powerful? I thought there weren't supposed to be powerful people here. If I'd known, we wouldn't have come, this guy is a monster. Earlier, they thought they'd come to crush the Midgardians, to see their shock, fear, and hear their cries. But instead, they indeed crushed some earthlings, but they met someone even more terrifying than them. Shock, fear, screams, being crushed, it turned out to be them. Previously, they even thought of teaching the enemy a lesson, instilling fear in them, and making them obediently hand over the ether. But it turned out they were the ones who were crazy, the ones being taught and made to fear. What those humans said was true. One person really could fight against their entire army, and they truly couldn't take anything from that person. Now, they regretted not listening to those humans, they could have stayed far away from this monster. In the end, the fools were them. The dark elves' bodies were carbonized and scorched with unwillingness, and Malekith, at the forefront, was completely vaporized. In the last moment of his life, Malekith's expression was dazed. Even without the ether, this guy could easily kill him and wipe out his army. They were the ones being tortured. The ones screaming turned out to be them. Hearing the anguished screams of his fellow dark elves, Malekith's heart was filled with unwillingness and disbelief. When did the Asgardians become so powerful? God of light. This guy is the god of light. How can he be this strong? With disbelief, regret, and hatred for this so-called god of light, the Asgardians, Odin, and others, Malekith completely dissipated and was vaporized. When the light finally receded, what came into view was scorched earth, charred corpses, and even half-melted warships. From afar, one could still see the faint red molten metal on the wrecked warships. It was clear how terrifying the high temperatures had been for the dark elves in that brief moment. Watching this, Syd only shook his head. After all that effort condensing the sunlight, it had only achieved this much power. Although Malekith was vaporized, it was mainly because he had received special attention, with most of the energy concentrated on him. The sun had exploded over too large an area, significantly reducing its power. All those dark elves who hadn't been directly targeted had their bodies left intact. Still, saying that the other dark elves hadn't received any special attention wasn't entirely accurate. When the sun exploded, Syd had slightly controlled the direction of the sunlight splatter, focusing a significant amount on the dark elves. Otherwise, some of the dark elves might still be alive now. It could only be said that sunlight was more suitable for concentrated attacks. Its scattered power was truly weak. Casting his gaze further out at the remaining warships, Syd casually controlled the sunlight. Boom, boom, boom. The beams reappeared, piercing through the fleeing warships. In a matter of moments, the entire sky cleared. In the distance, Tony and the others were deeply shocked. This guy, besides that terrifying Omega ability, actually had this kind of power as well. God of Light. Was that real? End of chapter. Chapter 220, Chapter 220. Looking at the scorched earth before them, Tony Stark and the others had complex expressions. Nick had mentioned before that the strange light phenomenon that appeared on Earth recently might be related to the white-clad hero standing before them, claiming he was the God of Light. At the time, they had been doubtful, not fully believing it. But now, witnessing his control over the sunlight, they began to believe that the phenomenon might indeed be connected to him. If that was true, could it mean the white-clad hero was hiding even more power? Just imagining the amount of strength it would take to cover the entire Earth in light left them inwardly shaken. At S.H.I.E.L.D. Watching the scene unfold, Director Fury and the Chitauri commander were filled with turmoil. It seems it'll be hard for my master to obtain the Reality Stone now. I need to come up with a solution. The Chitauri commander felt the weight of the situation. Meanwhile, Nick Fury turned to the agent analyzing the data. Have you calculated the range of the sunlight anomaly? Sir, we've got an estimate. The range was about 2 miles, the agent replied while pulling up footage. On the screen, the area where the white-clad hero stood darkened instantly. It was clear from the footage that this phenomenon lasted until the moment the white-clad hero released that sun, at which point everything returned to normal. As he watched the footage, Nick Fury squinted his eyes, feeling more and more apprehensive. The God of Light. Balder, huh? The name alone made it clear what kind of god he was, and with such control over sunlight, it didn't surprise Fury. As the God of Light, it would have been odd if he couldn't control the sun. What really unnerved Fury was not just the wide range of his control, but the possibility that this god was hiding even more power, and the fact that he could alter reality. Having read the mythological stories of Balder, the God of Light, that S.H.I.E.L.D. had gathered, Fury now had even more concerns. His single eye gleaming with an unspoken thought, Nick Fury turned to the black-suited Agent Hill. Agent Hill, how are the mistletoe weapons coming along? Fury asked gravely. They're almost ready, Agent Hill responded. I see. Fury squinted, his eyes reflecting something unreadable. He hadn't prepared mistletoe weapons without reason. Flipping through a brown book, Fury murmured, in Asgardian mythology, Balder, the god of light, is the second son of Odin and Frigga. He was beloved by all the Norse gods, radiant, incomparable, his wisdom highly praised, and no demon dared enter his bright hall. Fury's eyes narrowed. In the myths, the god of light, Balder, simply by existing, could ease the troubles of his subjects. But in the later parts of the story, he was frequently plagued by terrible nightmares. Each night, Balder dreamt of his own death. When Frigga, his mother, learned of this, she sought to protect him by traveling across the 9 realms, asking all beings to vow not to harm him. Her grace moved all things. Every animal, every element, every disaster, every plant, every blade, even insects. Except for a single mistletoe seedling, which grew east of Valhalla. It was too small and weak to cause harm, so Frigga overlooked it. But it was that small, weak mistletoe that became Balder's fatal weakness and the cause of his death. In the end, a mistletoe branch pierced the heart of the god of light, and in an instant, his divine light flickered out. In that moment, the entire 9 realms felt the impact of Balder's death. The sun lost its light and heat, and the world plunged into darkness. Balder's death foreshadowed the coming of Ragnarok, where day would inevitably be replaced by night, signaling the end, like a weapon of causality bringing about the doom of the gods. Turning the pages of the storybook, Fury muttered, I hope this will work. Because of this myth, he had specially prepared many mistletoe weapons, mistletoe arrows, bullets mixed with mistletoe, bombs, and more. Fury believed that myths didn't emerge from thin air. Perhaps this was the white-clad hero's only weakness. If one day the white-clad hero lost control, these weapons would be their only way to counter him. As for the consequences of Baldur's death, Fury instinctively brushed them aside. He didn't think it was possible. How could the sun simply lose its light and heat, plunging the world into darkness? Fury assumed that part of the myth was exaggerated. Based on Thor's behavior, the Asgardian gods probably didn't have such world-altering abilities. Back in Svartalfheim, the remaining Dark Elves immediately realized what had happened. They even witnessed the footage of their leader's death. This can't be. How could this happen? Watching the footage of their leader's demise, the Dark Elves were filled with shock and terror. A weak Midgard has such a powerful being. They were filled with both hatred and fear toward the one who had killed their leader. At this point, they had no plans to set foot on Earth again. Now, Earth had been marked as a forbidden zone. As for avenging their leader and comrades, they'd have to wait for another opportunity. Perhaps one day they'd find the white-clad hero in a weakened state, and only then would they act. But for now. Seeing the terrifying power of the white-clad hero, nearly every dark elf was filled with fear. Meanwhile, in Asgard, Frigga's eyes were filled with surprise. Divine power. Odin's expression was serious, mixed with confusion. From the sun the child had summoned at the end, Odin sensed traces of divine power. Moreover, that divine power felt strangely familiar. It seemed to be the same divine power passed down through the royal family of Asgard. Of course, given the distance, Odin wasn't sure if he had sensed it correctly. As for the child's divine bloodline, or other specifics about his godly nature, they couldn't be determined from this distance either. Only when this child stood before him would Odin be able to make a final judgment. Still, based on what he had already sensed, Odin's attitude had shifted. "I hope Thor can bring this child back to Asgard," Odin murmured. When he sent Thor to Midgard, he had instructed him not only to stop Malekith's plot but also to bring back the child with divine power so Odin could verify his identity. Heimdall, standing nearby, glanced at Odin and Frigga's expressions and couldn't help but show a knowing look. At this moment, his attitude toward the white-clad hero had also changed. End of chapter. Chapter 221, Chapter 221. Previously, Thor was at the top of the list, with Loki coming later. But now, the white-clad hero was ranked even ahead of Loki. Compared to the disliked frost giant Loki, Thor found himself liking this person more, someone who likely possessed the royal bloodline of the Allfather. On Earth. After carefully scanning to ensure there were no stragglers and that all the Dark Elves had been cleared, Syd relaxed slightly. With Malekith and the other Dark Elves dead, the trouble brought by the Reality Stone had also temporarily vanished. After this, besides Thanos, there shouldn't be too many others causing me problems. At least, not in the short term. Syd breathed a sigh of relief. Before long, he could focus on improving his strength again. Thinking this, the next second, his figure twisted, and his body, floating in midair, began to turn transparent, about to enter a stealth state. This scene left Tony Stark and the others gaping. Stealth? Just how many abilities did the white-clad hero possess? As Syd's figure completely disappeared in the air, Thor, standing among the crowd, finally reacted, shouting urgently, "Wait! Don't leave yet. I have something to talk to you about." Syd, who was just about to leave quietly in stealth mode, paused slightly upon hearing Thor's words. In an instant, he knew what Thor wanted to say. "He probably wants to persuade me to go to Asgard, right?" For a moment, Syd hesitated. He naturally wanted to go to Asgard, given the many treasures there. One of the things he desired most was the Infinity Gauntlet. However, he was somewhat wary of Odin. If Odin decided to attack him, Syd wasn't sure if he could withstand it. Despite Odin seemingly growing old and nearing death, Syd knew that it was just an appearance. The real reason was Odin's body could no longer contain his ever-expanding divine power, coupled with the plot-driven death in the future. The Asgardian gods only grew stronger with age. When Odin and the Ancient One were still alive, even Thanos likely hesitated to invade Earth because of that. And in the movies, Odin had never gone all out either. Syd believed that if Odin truly fought with all his strength, the results would be beyond anyone's expectations. Even now, he was uncertain whether he could face the Allfather Odin. After all, Odin's upper limit of power was a mystery, and the unknown was the most terrifying. In fact, he felt more confident in facing the Ancient One than Odin. At least the Ancient One had shown some of her capabilities, and Syd had a good understanding of her magic. Even if it ended in disaster, it wouldn't be as unpredictable as facing Odin. To go to Asgard would mean taking the risk of facing Odin, though the probability was small. Syd hesitated. After a while, he thought, forget it, I'll wait a bit longer. Once my divine light, divine word, and divine body are upgraded to level 5, I'll go to Asgard. By then, he would feel confident enough. Of course, even now, he wasn't without a chance against Odin or the Ancient One, it was just that he didn't have absolute confidence. After all, both of them hid their true strength extremely well, never revealing it fully. Still, it was possible to make an estimate. The goddess of death, Hela, was defeated by the fire giant Surtur, and Surtur could destroy all of Asgard with one strike. And yet, even someone like Surtur had been defeated by Odin. It was simply outrageous. Honestly, Syd couldn't fathom how much strength Odin was hiding, just like he couldn't understand why the Ancient One, who clearly had powerful magic, never used it. Two cunning old foes. Having decided to find Thor later, Syd's figure moved and flew away from the scene. In the distance. Seeing that no one appeared in the sky for a long time, Thor's face filled with expectation turned into disappointment as he murmured, "Why did it end like this?" Originally, he thought his brother would show up, and he could bring him back to Asgard joyfully. But now, things were completely different from what he imagined. His brother completely ignored him. Did I offend him in some way? Thor muttered in doubt. After asking around and learning the reason, Hawkeye consoled, maybe the white-clad hero has his own matters and reasons. Next time, he might go with you to Asgard. Barton is right. Despite everyone's comforting words, Thor mumbled, but this way, I'm stuck on Earth again. Black Widow and the others were confused. Only after a while did they realize that since Asgard's Bifrost had been destroyed, Thor must have used some special method to get here, and that special method clearly couldn't be used frequently and had some limitations. While they were talking, the news of what happened in New York began to spread online. Fury couldn't hide it even if he wanted to, the incident had too much of an impact. When netizens learned that New York had been invaded once again, discussions exploded. Are the Chitauri not wiped out yet? Who are these guys now? Does anyone know what's going on exactly? Because the incident took place in New York and there were relatively few casualties this time, many people recorded videos from afar. When these videos were uploaded online, netizens collectively gasped. Naturally, they weren't frightened by the aliens, those guys weren't much different from the Chitauri army. They were terrified of the white-clad hero's power. Watching the scenes of the white-clad hero repeatedly warping reality, many people felt their hearts shiver with fear. They also saw the scene of him using sunlight to obliterate those aliens. Seeing the white-clad hero, who appeared like a sun god, left netizens stunned. Those in the know even leaked some information, revealing that the white-clad hero was actually the god of light. The white-clad hero is also the god of light. We only knew he might be a god before, but he's the god of light. Netizens who weren't aware were left dumbfounded. This also made some people with ulterior motives even more wary. Watching the white-clad hero demonstrate more abilities, Dr. Bolivar and director Alessandro had grim expressions despite their shock. The white-clad hero's strength had increased even further. While they were discussing countermeasures and rumors were flying everywhere, Magneto and Professor X also heard about the event. They even heard rumors that the recent light phenomenon that had enveloped the entire Earth was related to the white-clad hero. Hearing this, Magneto and Professor Xavier were both stunned. End of chapter. Chapter 222, Chapter 222. 1500 PS reached. Thanks for your support. Brotherhood of Mutants. The news playing on the black television screen left Magneto, Eric, in disbelief. Incredible, an Omega-level mutant is really this powerful. Eric was amazed. Watching the scenes on TV, where the white-clad hero kept altering reality. No matter how many times he saw it, it always left him incredulous. Especially the rumor that the strange light phenomenon over Earth not long ago was also related to the white-clad hero. Another Omega-level ability. Or is it the power of a god? Magneto was filled with questions, unsure whether this white-clad hero was a mutant or a god. Out of the two known Omega-level mutants, Messiah was definitely a mutant, no doubt about it. But the white-clad hero's identity remained a mystery. He just appeared out of nowhere. Could he actually be a god? Magneto was initially disappointed, then thought of something else. Could he be a hybrid? It was rumored that this white-clad hero was Thor's brother. Could it be that he was the child of Odin and a human? A god and an Omega-level mutant. Otherwise, it was difficult to explain why Thor, also a god, was so weak while the white-clad hero's powers were so overwhelmingly strong, to the point of being terrifying. Of course, these were just his thoughts. The actual truth remained unknown. Still, compared to the white-clad hero, Magneto preferred Messiah. Not only because Messiah was undoubtedly an Omega-level mutant but also because he had an inexplicable fondness for him. X-Mansion. Professor, along with Cyclops and the others, were also watching the latest news. Everyone had a look of shock on their faces. Professor, was the strange phenomenon from a while ago really related to the white-clad hero? Cyclops, Scott, murmured. Charles glanced at him, hesitating. He wasn't entirely sure about that, but if it was true, he couldn't even imagine the terrifying power that the white-clad hero possessed. Thinking about it, he turned to the burly figure beside him. Logan, could you help me find Messiah? Professor X asked worriedly. Logan was stunned for a moment, then nodded. He knew why the professor made such a request. Besides the fact that Messiah was someone Logan knew, it was also because mutants were not in a good situation lately, often being hunted by Sentinel robots. With their current strength, they had no hope of dealing with the Sentinels. They were powerless. Only Messiah could handle those Sentinel robots. Having made up his mind, Logan discussed with Cyclops and the others before preparing to search for Messiah in the last place he disappeared. While they took action, the circle of sorcerers at Camartage was also watching the news. In a dimly lit room, Caecilius and a dozen other sorcerers were filled with shock, and their expressions quickly turned grim. It was hard for them to believe that someone so powerful could exist. Especially since this person was their enemy. The thought of losing the Tesseract and the Mind Stone to him recently only made their expressions darker. The Tesseract and the Mind Stone have been taken by him. How are we supposed to explain this to the great demon? Caecilius murmured in concern. Because of this, Caecilius hadn't dared to contact the demon proactively for some time, and the demon hadn't reached out to them either, which only made him more anxious, afraid that their great master had already abandoned them. Meanwhile, watching the news where a passerby speculated that the recent phenomenon was related to the white-clad hero, Caecilius and the others felt even more fearful. Of course, regarding the exaggerated phenomenon, they were unwilling to believe that it was done by the white-clad hero and preferred to think that it was the work of their great demon, their master. As various factions discussed the New York invasion event, some ordinary people were also making small moves. With Syd's identity as Balder, the god of light, fully exposed, the majority of people were fearful, intimidated, and frightened. However, a small portion felt excitement and exhilaration. These people were either sick, longing for power, or simply admired strong beings and gods, hoping to gain the attention of a deity. They began to offer their faith. It could be said that, with a large population, there would always be all sorts of people. This aspect came as a surprise to Syd. Because, without realizing it, he felt an increasing force of faith surrounding him. More and more. While surprised, Syd began to absorb it. For a moment, system notifications kept popping up. Divinity Experience +1. Divinity Experience +1. The notifications kept coming. The continuous influx of faith was pushing his divinity closer and closer to the threshold for leveling up. Ability, Divinity, 398/1000, Level 3. It still needs some time. Syd muttered. Estimating the speed at which the faith was coming, he figured it would be ready for an upgrade by tomorrow afternoon. Of course, if the supply of faith increased, it would happen even sooner. As for how the faith came to him, with just a little thought, Syd knew the answer. Thinking about it, he couldn't help but sigh inwardly, Thor really is a good guy. Without his big mouth spreading the word, my divinity might still be at level 1. Even when gods didn't show themselves, there were people who offered their faith, let alone when a real god was so obviously present. Naturally, ordinary people would try to worship. After all, this world would never lack greedy people, there would always be those trying to get something from a deity. He thought about this for a moment, then paused, murmuring, that's not entirely true. In the Marvel Universe, there were indeed heaven and hell, so it wasn't like miracles didn't exist, he just hadn't encountered them yet. There were even ghost riders, werewolves, vampires, mummies. Thinking about these supernatural beings, he soon dismissed the idea. Aside from heaven, hell, and other deities to be cautious of, vampires were the ones who should be worried if they met him. While his divinity approached a level up, Syd didn't sit idle. He kept channeling the light energy within him, striving to level up his divine power and divine body to level 5 as soon as possible before heading to Asgard. Meanwhile, he muttered a string of words. Divine light experience +1. Divine body experience +1. 1 times 1 is 1. Divine word experience +1. Simultaneously, he directed all his energy points toward the unlocking progress. Unlocking progress 71%. The next second, the unlocking progress blurred. End of chapter, chapter 223, chapter 223. 6 more reviews for a extra chapter. Unlocking progress 74%. Syd felt a bit disappointed. Will it be at 75% or 80% when I awaken a new ability? I wonder what the next ability will be. As he lamented, time flew by quickly, and before long, evening arrived. Though his divinity had not yet reached level 4, his divine word had advanced to level 4 first. Divine word experience +1. Ability, divine word, 0 out of 2000, level 4. As soon as the notification appeared, Syd's words became more profound, mysterious, and perfect, ever closer to the true speech of a god. He even felt he could easily alter his voice and imitate the sounds of other beings. Syd was quite satisfied with this ability, as it would make it much easier to disguise himself as the white-clad hero without awkwardly changing his voice, and no one would notice anything unusual. After testing his voice, Syd uttered a single word, light. The next moment, in harmony with his divine word, the dark, secluded corner he stood in suddenly shone brilliantly bright. Darkness was pierced as dazzling white light filled the entire area, engulfing everything in sight. Within a second, the light had spread over 100 meters, covering numerous houses. If not for Syd's quick reaction to stop the light from spreading, who knew how far it would have reached? In an instant, the 100-meter radius was as though a flashbang had been set off. The brightness was blinding, even to those inside buildings. Ah, what's going on? Shit! Screams echoed alongside the sound of objects falling chaotically. Clearly, in that brief moment, the sudden brightness caused discomfort, resulting in people dropping things and some even getting hurt. As the light receded, many of those affected sighed in relief, and so did Syd as he quickly left the area. In the distance, he could still hear some people cursing. Was that a flashbang? Damn it, who set it off? After leaving the area, Syd couldn't help but marvel at how different the 4th level was. The effect of the divine word had risen drastically. It seems I should be careful with my words from now on, or else. Syd shook his head. After further testing, he discovered that anything related to light he spoke of would inevitably come true, though the effect wasn't permanent. Maybe at level 5, I'll have complete control. Syd mused, feeling a bit troubled. As he both worried and continued practicing his various abilities, time gradually passed, and soon it was the next morning. On a deserted grassy field, a white figure stood in the sunlight. At that moment, Syd's eyes were filled with anticipation. After a night had passed, the force of faith had grown more and more, directly pushing his divinity to the threshold of leveling up. The next second, the notification sounded. Divinity experience +1. Ability, Divinity, 0/2000, level 4. In an instant, Syd felt a mysterious force fill his entire body. His flesh, blood, soul, and spirit. In just a few moments, as the force filled his being, Syd felt every aspect of himself was enhanced. His divine body became stronger, his soul more pure, his spirit more powerful. The next moment, a red glow appeared in his hand, the glow of chaos magic. Syd sensed that his chaos magic had become much stronger. Raising his hand casually, a fist-sized rock nearby was instantly enveloped in a red glow. The next second, with a boom, the rock turned into powder. Syd fell into contemplation. Although chaos magic was only at level 4, he estimated that he could easily rip apart a non-Infinity Stone Thanos now. Even those Sentinel robots, even if they turned into metallic form, Syd guessed he could tear them apart or blast them to pieces. Not bad. Compared to before, when chaos magic had to be used in bursts to deal with the Sentinels, this is much better now. Even without altering reality, the Sentinel robots should be easy to handle. After testing the strength of his various abilities for a bit, Syd shifted his focus to his most anticipated area, his flight speed. Holding a stopwatch, the next moment, his figure disappeared from where he stood. Boom. A terrifying sonic boom echoed. In the blink of an eye, Syd appeared in the distance. Looking at the data displayed on the stopwatch, and after a round of calculations, surprise appeared in his eyes. At level 3 divinity, his flight speed barely reached 5.4 times the speed of sound. Now that his divinity had reached level 4, his flight speed had increased to 7 times the speed of sound. 7 times the speed of sound, huh? This speed. Syd found it satisfactory. Most importantly, if his divinity reached level 5, his speed might surpass 10 times the speed of sound. If his divine light reached level 5 as well, his speed would likely double. Expectation filled Syd's eyes. Even at his current speed, unless observed from a great distance, no ordinary person could see him move when he was nearby. To put it specifically, his current speed had already surpassed that of a regular bullet. With that in mind, he continued channeling the light energy within himself, striving to push divine light to level 5 as soon as possible. While channeling the energy, Syd casually changed his attire. The fame of the white-clad hero was overwhelming, so he seized an opportunity to switch to Messiah's outfit. By the time afternoon arrived, as Syd was quietly moving, he suddenly spotted a screen in a shop playing some footage from a distance. Syd's gaze turned toward it, and he saw an old acquaintance. There she was, dressed in a light pink dress, her face lightly made up. Irina was speaking. "Hello, everyone. It's been a while. Today, Irina is bringing you some good news." Irina blinked playfully and said, "What exactly is it?" "Let me keep you in suspense, it'll be revealed soon." Watching Irina's broadcast on the screen, Syd's brows immediately furrowed. In an instant, his gut told him that whatever this woman was saying, it wasn't good. Or rather, it wasn't good for him. Just as he thought that, the shopkeeper inside started cursing at Irina. At the same time, an unexpected scene unfolded. A brawny man in military uniform, with a commanding presence, suddenly appeared 5 meters to Syd's right. Syd immediately grew cautious. He remembered clearly that no one had been there a moment ago. This man seemed to have teleported here. Just as he thought this, while staying on guard, something unexpected happened. A force of spatial energy appeared. In the blink of an eye, Syd found himself transported away from his original location, now standing in a deserted wasteland. Before he could observe his surroundings, a sense of danger engulfed him. End of chapter. Chapter 224, Chapter 224. Syd's expression changed slightly. Instinctively, he immediately used spatial transfer. Spatial transfer experience +1. In an instant, his figure vanished from the spot and reappeared 10 meters away. He flashed again, using spatial transfer a second time. Simultaneously, a sense of danger washed over him. Boom. A terrifying explosion occurred, and a wave of intense heat rolled over. Rebound shield experience +1. Rebound shield experience +1. Is this a bomb? Looking at the approaching flames and heat, Syd instantly summoned 4 level 4 rebound shields to protect himself. After completing these defenses, the explosion engulfed him. In a matter of moments, the shockwave spread over 800 meters, destroying everything in its path. Plants and animals were obliterated, and several layers of earth were torn away. While this scene unfolded, in a military base far from the site of the explosion, a group of American military personnel, including some operators monitoring equipment, stared at the explosion on their screens with shining eyes. General Luca praised a nearby soldier, saying, "Leonard, you did well." The men being praised, dressed in a military uniform, tall and strong, with an aura of a seasoned soldier, was none other than the men who had appeared beside Syd earlier. Apparently, right after using his teleportation ability to take Syd to the wasteland, Leonard had instantly teleported back. Facing General Luca's praise, Leonard modestly responded with a few humble words. Watching the explosion spread across several hundred meters on the screen, with Messiah engulfed in the explosion, Leonard felt both proud and confident that the target was dead. With such a vast explosion, Messiah couldn't have escaped. Caught off guard and subjected to such a powerful blast, even an Omega-level mutant would be doomed. The bomb's yield had also been meticulously calculated. Far more powerful than the missile Messiah had withstood last time. According to the calculations of the personnel, Messiah was definitely dead. The value far exceeded his defensive limits. Disgusting mutant, Omega-level or not, you still end up dead by our technology. No matter how powerful you are, you're still flesh and blood. Let's see how you withstand this explosion. The dozens of soldiers present were all smiling, discussing amongst themselves, staring expectantly at the screen as if they had already seen Messiah's remains obliterated. As several generals and officers discussed and observed, Irina, who had just started her broadcast and had previously left everyone in suspense, switched the footage to the explosion. Looking at the hundreds of meters of explosion now on screen, countless viewers watching the live broadcast showed expressions of shock and surprise. What is this? An explosion. What is Irina doing, showing this? As countless ordinary people and even some superheroes and villains were confused, Irina smiled and explained, this explosion was orchestrated by the military. At the center of the explosion is the Omega-level mutant, Messiah. With such a massive range, even Messiah, being an Omega-level mutant, must perish on the spot, hee. Listening to Irina's sweet voice, countless people suddenly understood, then grew excited as they watched the explosion. Could Messiah finally be dead? Many who feared mutants hoped so. Stark Tower. An hour ago, having received Irina's live broadcast preview, Tony, who was originally just curious about what she was up to, watched the broadcast. His face changed instantly. In that moment, he felt disdain, feeling ashamed of the military's actions. What kind of despicable means did they use to deal with Messiah, just a child? Watching the explosion spread over 800 meters, even Tony Stark wasn't sure if Messiah could survive. Even for an Omega-level mutant, to endure such a terrifying explosion head-on. Judging by the data from the last time Messiah withstood the missile, Tony sighed inwardly. At this moment, besides Tony, Captain America and his team, as well as Magneto and Professor X, were also watching Irina's broadcast. Steve Rogers and the others had mixed feelings. Magneto and Professor X, compared to them, were visibly more worried. As the only two Omega-level mutants in the world, the strongest among mutants, they did not want Messiah to die. Apart from the connection of being mutants and not wanting to lose one of their own, they also had personal feelings. They had a strange sense of fondness for Messiah. Mystique Raven, Wolverine Logan, and others were also watching the broadcast, feeling anxious. Could Messiah really? Camartage. After the incident involving the white-clad hero, Caecilius and the other sorcerers had been closely monitoring the Omega-level mutant, and now their faces were filled with regret. Is that young man, who was also called an Omega-level mutant alongside the white-clad hero, going to die? Caecilius and the others shook their heads. It seemed that there were differences even among Omega-level mutants. Messiah and the white-clad hero were not the same, Messiah was weaker. The white-clad hero, who had taken their tesseract, seemed much stronger. As they thought about it, the explosion's aftermath gradually dissipated, and the dust settled. The scene at the center of the explosion slowly came into view. Noticing this, the host Irina curled her bright red lips, smiling as she said, "The scene in front of you is the good news I have for you." But before she could finish, the scene revealed at the center of the explosion left her speechless. She stood there, mouth wide open, staring in disbelief at the image emerging from the explosion. A large crater, several hundred meters wide, lay before them. Inside, everything had been destroyed, except for a single figure. It was a figure clad in black, completely unscathed. He floated quietly in the air, without any visible signs of injury, his clothes were not even slightly damaged. Messiah had actually endured such a terrifying explosion. And even his clothes were untouched. Ah! Irina screamed, unable to believe her eyes. Not just her, in the mysterious military base, the dozens of officers who had been eagerly waiting for Messiah to be blown to pieces were all in disbelief. Impossible. How could Messiah withstand such a massive explosion? Even an Omega-level mutant is still flesh and blood. End of chapter. Chapter 225, Chapter 225. 500 PS reached. Next goal, 1000 PS. Reviews, 115/120. Of course, the reason they were so shocked and incredulous was mainly that their calculations showed that the blast's power far exceeded Messiah's limits. In other words, Messiah should not have been able to withstand it. The scene before them was completely different from what they had calculated. You must know, last time when Messiah was chased and bombarded by missiles, he ended up covered in soot, his clothes in tatters, looking extremely ragged, as if he could barely hold on. If not for him retreating into the city in the end, perhaps. Now, this explosion covering more than 800 meters caused destruction far beyond the repeated missile bombardments last time. Yet Messiah, not only was he not covered in soot or with tattered clothes, but his clothing wasn't even damaged. The difference between this time and last time was enormous. The dozens of military officers and a few generals were in disbelief. What on earth was going on? As they were doubting what they saw, Messiah quietly hovering in the air also astonished Tony Stark at Stark Tower. What was happening? Seeing Messiah unscathed was completely beyond his expectations. According to his calculations, Messiah shouldn't have been able to endure this explosion. If Messiah had disappeared from the center of the explosion by teleporting away, he wouldn't have been as surprised. But now, it was evident that Messiah had endured the explosion head-on. This was entirely different from what he had thought. Even if Messiah had managed to escape, he would have been gravely injured, perhaps even near death. Shit. Tony Stark was stunned. Besides him, the other Avengers watching Irina's broadcast were similarly shocked. Magneto and Professor X breathed a sigh of relief before expressing their amazement. Unscathed. The two of them marveled. Kamartaj. Kaecilius and the other sorcerers were in shock. This Messiah, he was completely unharmed. Was this the power of the other Omega-level mutant? No wonder this young man was also called an Omega-level mutant. This power was indeed impressive, they thought. At this moment, countless viewers watching the broadcast felt their initial excitement vanish, replaced by a stunned expression. The explosion, which looked terrifying to them, had been blocked just like that. They were both shocked and confused, soon giving way to anger. Irina, is this the surprise you promised us? How do you explain this? Didn't you say Messiah should be dead by now? Irina, you garbage. After the shock wore off, viewers vented their anger at Irina. Of course, Irina was aware of the audience's anger, and quickly reassured them, "Don't worry, my dear viewers, the military's preparations are far from over." After she said that, Tony and the others, as well as the viewers, showed surprise and confusion. Were there more preparations? The next second, they saw Irina smile and say, "Does everyone remember the last time Messiah was bombarded by missiles?" The audience was taken aback. Of course, they were familiar with that incident. It was one of the rare moments when Messiah had looked so pathetic, and they had never seen him in such dire straits before. Irina continued smiling. "Last time, Messiah endured it. This time, he definitely won't. We've arranged a large number of missiles, far more than last time, enough to destroy him." As soon as she finished speaking, her words were immediately validated. Almost as soon as Messiah was seen unscathed, numerous white missiles flew from the distance. Densely packed and continuous, they extended far beyond the horizon. Seeing this, the viewers felt a renewed sense of excitement, while Charles Xavier and others felt their hearts sink. What worried them even more was Irina's further comment, delivered with a smile, and this time, considering the failure last time, there are some differences in the missiles. Not only are they more powerful, but they also hit their target at much faster speeds, almost 6 times the speed of sound, much faster than the missiles used last time. With such high-speed missiles, Messiah cannot possibly escape. Only one outcome awaits him. Irina spoke confidently, her face full of assurance. Hearing this, the viewers' eyes lit up. 6 times the speed of sound. My God, Messiah is definitely finished. At such a speed, who could possibly dodge? This time, Messiah is really done for, haha. The viewers were in an uproar, marveling at the missile speed. At this moment, in Stark Tower, Tony Stark sighed. Though the missile speed Irina mentioned wasn't anything unimaginable, he knew Messiah's flight speed very well. He had even calculated it multiple times. As Irina said, Messiah wouldn't be able to dodge. Of course, that wasn't to say Messiah's speed was lacking. To achieve the speed of sound as a biological entity had already astonished Tony Stark and shaken his understanding of physics. It was just that, in terms of speed, technology held the advantage. How could flesh and blood outpace steel machinery? As he thought about it, Tony's feelings became conflicted. He knew that Messiah might not be able to survive this time. The location was clearly a wasteland, far from any city. The military had clearly planned this well. While Tony remained silent, Captain America and the others reached similar conclusions, feeling deeply conflicted. Brotherhood of Mutants. Magneto Eric's face changed dramatically, and he sat upright. X-Mansion. Charles's expression shifted, becoming resolute. He immediately asked Scott, who was beside him, to take him to the Cerebro chamber. This was something he shouldn't do, but to save Messiah's life, he had no choice but to use Cerebro to attempt to control the thoughts of those military personnel and stop them from launching more missiles. Even if doing so later led to retaliation against mutants, or even if the military would try to eliminate him, he had to act. He had to stop the military from killing Messiah. It wasn't just because Messiah represented something significant among mutants, but also because, in his heart, Charles didn't want this young man to die. Sigh, I hope I make it in time. Looking at the live broadcast, Professor X was filled with concern. Beside him, Logan and others were also nervous as they surrounded Charles and headed towards the Cerebro chamber. Meanwhile, at Camartage, Caecilius and the other sorcerers sighed. It seemed that of the only 2 Omega-level mutants, one was about to die. End of chapter.